love it back here. You're always right there with the ball.
If I could call to order the January 25th, 2011 meeting of the Placer County Board of Supervisors. If you would join me in a flag salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And would you read our meeting procedures, please?
Welcome to the Placer County Board of Supervisors meeting of January 25th, 2011. Agendas are available on the wall outside this meeting room. If you are here to speak on an issue not appearing on the agenda, you may do so during the public comment period. There's a 3-minute time limit per speaker. The board is not permitted to take action on items addressed under public comment. When you speak, clearly state your name and address for the record. All items on the agenda will be open for the public to address before final action is taken. There's a 3-minute time limit per speaker, which will be monitored by a timer on the podium. If there is a person speaking on behalf of a group with no other testimony from another member of the group, please identify yourself as such, and your time may be extended at the pleasure of the board. Keep in mind that the chairman has the discretion of limiting the total discussion time on any item. If you are hearing impaired, we have listening devices available. It is requested that all pagers and cell phones be either turned off or put in the silent mode. Thank you for your participation and cooperation.
Thanks, Ann. Next is the time for public comment. This is the time when anybody can approach the board on something that is not on the agenda, keeping in mind that we will not be able to take any action, but we'd be happy to hear your public comments. So if there is someone who'd like to comment in a public comment, please come forward and state your name.
My name is Marty Backus. My address is P.O. Box 8021, Albany, California, 95608. I want you and the public to know what happens when I complain to the
Board of Supervisors about weapons of invisible warfare. Someone called me and asked for Mr. Strain, and then Ruth. Then they said, okay, I got it, and hung up. Next, I got a message on my machine from Placer County Mental Health Adult Protective Services. After that, 2 deputies went to my friend's house in Penryn and interrogated him about me. Then the 2 sheriffs came to my aunt's house in Meta Vista and interrogated me. I was a federal civil servant at McClellan for 14 years. I was a radome inspector, one of my 4 jobs there. Last year, I went to the U.S. District Court I took the same oath as you took in my federal service without the California portion. Last year, I went to the U.S. District 4 Court in Sacramento and gave them the same complaint I gave you. The court clerk agreed with me and gave me this package to file a civil complaint. I went to my attorney, Russell Robinson, and he said he would take care of it. I told him that the people doing this were domestic enemies to the Constitution of the United States. Russell Robinson and I signed a contract, which I have here, and he is taking care of this for me. He told me I should write a book and to call him every 2 weeks and to let him know how I was doing. In the past 9 years, I found only a handful of deputies, correction officers, county employees, and 2 judges that are honest and have done their jobs well. I've found 50-plus people working in the court, jail, DA's office, and county buildings I feel are criminals. As I told you last time, I have given copies of all my complaints to the FBI starting in 2001 with my environmental health hazard report and a copy of the book I gave the board. On one visit to the FBI, the agent said, I think you have a case here. That was a year or so back. Everyone in this county has tried to prove I have mental health issues because of my complaints. The FBI hasn't, and they haven't arrested me for filing a false report. I've given them all the same reports. However, I was arrested for filing a false report of child molestation along with other crimes. Those were not false reports, and those crimes have been covered up for 8 years by the sheriff and the county DA.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anyone else who'd like to address the board? Public comment? Seeing none, I'll close public comment. Now is the time for supervisor committee reports. Jan.
Yes, good morning. I just wanted to report out on the Criminal Justice Policy Committee. We had a meeting last Wednesday. Facility Services reported on the status of the jail, which is coming along nicely. Probation reported on some of the proposed programs that may be coming back to the county with regards to sentencing, and also the court discussed some of the financing for court security and some of the projects there. Thank you.
Anyone else? Seeing none, we'll move to the consent agenda. This is a list of items to be intended to be taken all in one motion. But if one of my colleagues would like to pull it, or someone pull anything, or someone from the public who would like to pull an item, would be happy to do that and discuss it.
I would like to pull item 21 for a brief discussion.
Anything else?
Good morning. I'm Ellie Waller. I'm a North Tahoe resident. I would ask that consent item 9A, committee assignments, be looked at to pull one of the committee assignments only. I'm not asking for the entire item to be pulled. I'm requesting the venue change to Tahoe, as the residents and businesses have expressed their desire to have this heard at their local jurisdiction. This should be in your board packet. I have additional comments, and I will turn those into Ann as I leave. As we understand it, the board members do not believe that Ms. Montgomery is acting on behalf of the county's direction.
I apologize, but her comments would be appropriate once we've taken action.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
I wasn't sure the process.
We'll have the opportunity to comment on it once it's been pulled off consent, and then we hear it, okay?
Okay, thank you very much.
You betcha.
Pull the item, then we'll discuss it as if it were put on the agenda accordingly. Anything else?
Yeah, I have just one simple question on the redevelopment agency board. That's 20A. I wonder if that report would be available for the public to review at some later date.
20A, the independent auditor's report?
Yes.
I'm sure it would be available. Yeah, is that your request, just to have a copy of that?
Yeah, that's all.
Okay, so yeah, why don't we leave that on the consent
Yes,
agenda?
that's fine
We'll get
on
you a
the
copy.
agenda. I just wanted to know if I could get a copy. Thank you.
You bet. Anything else? Okay, let's...
Remaining items.
It's been moved and seconded to adopt the consent agenda with the two items pulled. Roll call, Ann?
Holmes?
Aye.
Duran?
Yes.
Bueller? Montgomery? Weigand?
Yes. So let's start with item 9, which is the board committee assignments, 9A on page 133.
Mr. Chair, if I could provide a little bit of background, and then Ms. Wallers would probably like to come back to the podium. This is an action item. It's to confirm the Board of Supervisors 2011 Board and Commission assignments as designated at your last meeting per the attached list. It's my understanding, pursuant to the comments at the podium, that the only one that was actually of some discussion is the potential appointment of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, TRPA. The action before your board is to appoint Larry Sevenson as the board's designated representative and Supervisor Montgomery as the alternate.
Okay. So with that, would you like to come back to the podium? And
Thank you for correcting the protocol. As we understand it, the board members do not believe that Ms. Montgomery is acting on recommendations and decisions and removing her and replacing her with Larry Sevenson, a longtime Tahoe resident. There is no intended disrespect for Mr. Stevenson. I recommend you listen to the October Board of Supervisors and December TRPA Governing Board tapes for clarity on what Ms. Montgomery actually said and suggested and has been reported, and defer your decision on that seat until such time. The constituents of Placer County elected Jennifer on her platform in support of communities having voice on local issues. Why bother electing a supervisor if we don't have a democratic system? I feel this is an unfair practice. The county removes supervisors when they don't vote the county line. Supervisor Krantz was removed during his tenure for not voting on the 3-lane, 4-lane controversial issue. Alan Bruce was recently removed from our Advisory Planning Commission at the TRPA. I'm not sure I understand why. What voice does the community truly have when members of county staff that are located in Tahoe and here are removed or replaced to have staff deliver a predetermined outcome? Who analyzes staff recommendations and specifically determines what type of project is good for the North Shore or anywhere in Tahoe? The broader concern is that Tahoe-related items should be heard in Tahoe. I understand the unique circumstances of getting your other committee members assigned, but are hoping that you could possibly defer the TRPA committee assignment to a Tahoe meeting. Additionally, several other items on today's agenda are Tahoe-related. 12B, Biomass Plant Utilization Project. 16B, Lake Forest Water Improvement District Project. 6C, under cooperative agreements, which include North Lake Tahoe, Commercial Core, Kings Beach, the Tahoe City Y improvements, housing development, etc. We are requesting that future agenda items that are Tahoe-specific try to be heard in Tahoe. Possibly additional Tahoe meetings need to be scheduled, as the first one isn't until April. Respectfully, and thank you for your time. Ellie Waller, Tahoe Vista resident.
Thank you for your comments. Just some clarification, I guess. The board actually does have a long history of going up into the mountains and collecting items that are specific to the mountain area to be heard up there. And we do that at least 3 times a year, and we'll continue to do that. There are occasions when we actually have to take action just to continue business and not delay things, and that's the current circumstance as it relates to this committee assignment. There's a TRPA meeting tomorrow, so your point's well taken, but just for the record, I wanted to let everyone know that the board actually is very committed to trying to hear as much as we possibly can in proximity to the residents that are affected by those decisions. So is there anyone else who'd like to address this?
Good morning. I'm Ron Grassi. I'm a 40-year Tahoe City resident. I'm also the co-conservation chair for the Sierra Club. I wanted to discuss with you what you're contemplating and make sure that we all are looking at the same facts and the same legal issues. It's obvious, if you read the newspapers, at the lake at least, that what you're considering doing has really stirred up a hornet's nest, because a very strong majority of the constituents in the Tahoe area voted for Jennifer Montgomery and not for Mr. Stevenson. So we have a problem right there, because it would be like President Obama is going to speak tonight and somehow somebody takes him off and puts somebody else in his place from a different party. It doesn't work that way. And so I want to make sure we slowly take a look at what the law is in part, and I'm not claiming to be a practicing attorney. I'm a retired attorney, but maybe you can talk again to your own attorney and see if his advice differs from mine. You have to understand, and I think you do, that you're bound by the Brown Act, and also TRPA is bound by the Nevada's version of the Brown Act, and every state in the country has its own version of the Brown Act, open meetings to the public. And California has SB 1732, Nevada has the NRS 241. I want to make sure you understand what California's position is on why we have open meetings, and I therefore, I don't see your county council here, so I'll just keep this. Oh, I beg your pardon. Tony? I'm sorry, I saw you before.
I like to hide, you know.
Lawyers go to law school to learn that trick. But I want to call to your attention, there was a case, Sacramento Newspaper Guild versus Sacramento Board of Supervisors, and the citation, Tony, is 263, Cal App 2nd, 41. I'll give it to you again at the end of the meeting if you like. The case arose under different facts, but it happened to involve 5 supervisors and had a meeting, but then it involved a strike, which is not present here, but that's not one of the main issues of the case. But the issue came down to what is expected by a legal board, an agency board in California, and what it came down to was the word deliberate. They're supposed to deliberate, and so the case said the following. To deliberate, and by the way, the decision is over 30 pages, so I'm not saying that I'm telling you the whole case. I'm going to read to you the select portion that's relevant to today's hearing. To deliberate is to examine, weigh, and reflect upon the reasons for and against the choice. Public choices are shaped by reasons of fact, reasons of policy, or both. Does that mean I have to stop?
Well, if you could wrap up fairly quickly, please.
I'm both on behalf of an organization plus a resident, but I get a little more than 3 minutes possibly.
Okay.
Public choices are shaped by reasons of fact, reasons of policy, or both. Any of the agency's functions may include or depend upon the ascertainment of the facts. The ascertainment of the facts. Deliberation thus connotes not only collective discussion, but the collective acquisition and exchange of facts preliminary to the ultimate decision, which means you can't send someone to a meeting with a vote already determined. That person has to have an open mind. That person has to participate in the deliberation process and hear new ideas, different ideas expressed differently. And Mr. Sevenson cannot, therefore, go up there being told ahead of time, Larry, this is how you vote. He'll violate the act. I therefore, I'll try to wrap up and skip a couple of points, and I'll just make the following. I think this is an incredibly important decision. I think it's a ultra vires act. You're going beyond what is permitted under California law. I think you should wait and ponder it. In fact, I think you should deliberate among yourselves and with your county and with county council to see if, in fact, you can do something like this. Supervisors are allowed to vote the way they see appropriate. And so I think you need to take a close look at that. I'm asking, therefore, that you postpone this particular decision until it can be heard up at Lake Tahoe, where also hundreds, if not more, constituents can come to the hearing to hear why their representative that they listened to and voted for can't participate in the most important single board at the lake, which is the TRPA board. So I think you should give it a chance to study what you want to do and also let the constituents hear it. I also want to point out something else, not that this is the Boston Tea Party type issue exactly, but Tahoe is taxed substantially by Placer County, and that's fine, but in exchange we have a representative, and we've picked our representative, and now you've taken our representative away as far as TRPA, which is basically the most important single function that I believe that she has for us. I think that's also, therefore, improper. So, and finally, I would say one last thing. You have to keep in mind, in my opinion, something. Districts 1 through 4 have much different issues than District 5. It's almost an anomaly that the lake is part of Placer County in the sense of what pertains to us. And I frankly don't think that we ever have a strong interest in what you do in 1 through 4, but we certainly have a strong interest in District 5, and it seems strange that this is happening the way it's happening. So I would ask that you deliberate among yourselves, seek a further legal opinion from Tony, and consider whether or not I'm mistaken when I say to you that supervisors are allowed to vote their conscience. They are allowed to vote their way. Are there any questions?
I see none.
Okay.
Thank you. Do you have any?
Want to respond?
None. And if you feel so compelled.
Compelled, no, but I had such a low profile up there.
You're going to talk?
I was invited by the chairman to say, I don't disagree with the premise that The board cannot direct anybody to go to an adjudicative or legislative body and vote a certain direction. I've given that opinion consistently over the years. So you can't tell somebody, if you're on that committee, you have to vote. That does not follow that when you're on a committee, you can't be fired. The board can exercise its judgment of who shall sit on a committee, who wants to sit on the committee, and that committee judgment has to reflect the feeling of the majority of the board because they appoint the members to the committee. And frankly, I think there was much discussion on this issue. This was on the agenda last time. It was an open meeting. The public did not attend, but there must have been a 15 or 20-minute discussion of this subject. Maybe that's my rough idea.
1 20-second rebuttal if I could.
No, but
And so the fact of the matter is that, Mr. Stephenson can't be sent off to TRPA with walking papers, and this is how he will vote on every issue. In fact, that would be virtually impossible to do, because unless the board's prepared to read all the TRPA agendas and take votes on them in advance, it would be nearly impossible, and they wouldn't have all the evidence. But the fact is, if they feel that some issue is important, and they want to project a policy which they have shaped and bring it forward, they can watch, and if their policies aren't being effectuated, try to do it in a different way by having different representation on the committee. I don't think that's either a violation of the Brown Act, nor is it a violation of the law in California. Now, I agree, can't tell them how to vote. But if you're disappointed in the vote, you can think, well, maybe that's not the reflection of the judgment we want there on a consistent basis. And, frankly, most votes from my many, many years reflect the judgment of the incumbent committee member or commissioner based upon the facts they hear at the hearing. If you have questions about that judgment, it's a series of issues. Secondly, there's nothing in the TRPA law compact that says the elected supervisor has to be the appointee. You don't elect a TRPA member to the board, governing board of TRPA. The law says the board appoints. And I've been here 26 years, and I would estimate nearly half of those years the incumbent's 5th District Supervisor was not the appointee and did not sit as the representative of the Board of Supervisors. Almost all of Supervisor Bloomfield's term, he did not sit as the representative at TRPA. And I can't remember whether Eric sat or didn't sit. Supervisor Euler sat for a while. Mr. Stephenson sat for a great many years as an appointee through much of my career here. So there's not an election for board member to the TRPA by the 5th District population.
I'm not arguing that either.
then we're not going to get into a...
I can't respond?
No. You've had your chance to speak. Would you like to address the
I
board,
didn't know
please?
about what he was going to say. That's the difference. I didn't know what he was going to say, so I'm just saying that it would help the board to know there's...
Appreciate your comment. You had your chance to make your presentation. I'd only add that the issue that is reflecting the disagreement was also thoroughly vetted and discussed by the board in October up in the basin. So with that, next speaker is welcome to come forward.
Do I have to turn it? It's on, okay.
No, you're set. Thanks.
My name is Leah Kaufman, but I'm here on behalf of 45 businesses, so I would like to indulge in a few more minutes of time.
If you could keep it as short as possible, would appreciate it. Thank
Okay. Again, my name is Leah Kaufman. I'm a 35-year Tahoe resident and local business owner. Last week, 33 businesses, which of today have grown to 45, unanimously petitioned your board to hold the replacement hearing for Jennifer Montgomery at Lake Tahoe, even if this involves a special meeting, so that it can be more inclusive of the local community who elected her. The diverse business community consists of homeowners associations with hundreds of members, represented by manager Dave Hansen of Tahoe Tavern Property Owners Association, Tavern Shores Association, Chambers Landing HOA, Star Harbor Association, and Villas at Lake Forest, Frank Rossman of Brockway Springs, Dave Wilderotter of Dave's Ski Shops, engineers Tim Farrell, Kevin Drake of Integrated Environmental, architect Don Fulda of Ward Young Architects, Elise Fett Architect, restaurant owner Steve Topol, motel providers Holiday House, Firelight Lodge, Cedar Glen Lodge, America's Best Value, Rustic Cottages, the list goes on. Numerous folks in the real estate profession, Nora and Bill Leader, Sue Daniels, Trudy Lee, Ann Nichols, to name a few. Teresa Odette of Odette Mortgage Group, Hugh McBride, local appraiser, accountants, consultants, service workers, etc. The geographic location of these local businesses range from West Shore, Squaw Valley, Tahoe City, Tahoe Vista, Carnelian Bay, Kings Beach, Kingswood, and Brockway North State Line. Although not all the business owners, or community members agree with Jennifer's decisions on every planning matter, all feel that she understands the local perspective on TRPA matters, is easily approachable, and was elected as a voice for the Tahoe Basin portion of Placer County. The 5th District Supervisor should be given the choice to be seated on the TRPA Governing Board and only removed under the most egregious breaches of conduct, which is simply not the case in this situation. Jennifer has been clear, I think she was clear in your October meeting, regarding her stance that her position on TAUs are dynamic in nature and might change as the regional plan evolves. The straw vote taken at TRPA in December, I was at that meeting, was a unanimous decision by all the TRPA board members to study a wide range of alternatives as part of the environmental document, and Jennifer's vote and the board's vote reflected this flexibility. This decision, what is that?
It means that 3 minutes up, so
Okay.
appreciate it if you could.
This decision also reflected the community's position for this very contentious issue. It can be argued, and I also agree, that Larry also understands local issues and is an experienced board member. The difference is that Larry is appointed and not elected, and the voters of North Shore overwhelmingly voted for Jennifer to represent their community concerns, and as such, the reasons for her removal should be discussed locally. Perhaps it is time that Tahoe expresses its own opinion. The other 4 districts that belong to Placer County have a different environment than Tahoe and different needs. Tahoe should have the status it deserves as one of the great treasures in this world and its own voice that goes along with it, which is the only fair thing to do. We need a paradigm shift. In closing, I would urge that the board defer its replacement of Jennifer Montgomery and allow the stakeholders direct involvement in being part of the process. And I have an updated list of the 45 businesses and hundreds of homeowners association members.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to address this issue? With that, then, I'll bring it back to the board for action. Jennifer.
Thank you. Yes, and I want to thank those folks who showed up today from Tahoe. I've had discussions, I think, with probably almost all of you regarding this issue, and I have, I think, been pretty clear from the beginning that this board, under our existing policy, absolutely has the authority to remove me or anyone else from this seat. The larger question that I see here is, you know, is the policy an appropriate policy? And I think that's really the issue that you guys are raising here. Unfortunately, that is not on our agenda for a discussion item for today. What I would hope is that at some point this board, as a deliberative body, revisit that question as it relates to this policy specifically. A couple of things that I really wanted to touch on. One of the issues that's been raised was that in October, I voted in support of Placer County's policy. And I just wanted to note what it was that we actually voted on in October, and that was we directed staff to resubmit comments reflecting Placer County's position on the TRPA regional plan update related to land use, transportation, noise, soil conservation, water quality, stream environment and stream environment zone sub-element policies that were not fully vetted in the TRPA staff report to the governing board. I did make the motion to move this forward because as a TRPA governing board member, we asked everyone, Placer County, Douglas County, the League to Save Lake Tahoe, Friends of Tahoe Vista, to resubmit pieces of policy that they had concerns about that may not have been addressed fully from their perspective within the regional plan discussion that we had. So yes, I did make the motion to have Placer County bring their position back to the TRPA governing board. At that meeting, I think I made very clear both at the beginning of my statement and at the end of my statement that I did not support everything in the document, but I supported returning the document to the TRPA for the TRPA and governing board's review, because I think it's very important that all participants, all stakeholders in the process have their voices heard, and that absolutely includes Placer County. So I just wanted to really clarify what that discussion was in October and what my comments were on that. We did have a discussion 2 weeks ago, this board, in public session on the committee and commission appointees. At that time, I made a fairly spirited defense of why I should remain on the TRPA governing board, with a nod to understanding that the current policy allows this board to remove me. This board chose at that point on a 4-to-1 vote to make, me being the one, by the way, to make a recommendation to remove me from the TRPA governing board. That is a policy that they certainly can adhere to. And this board can certainly stand on that policy. I stand on the principle that I sit on the TRPA governing board both as a representative for Placer County, but also as a representative for the constituents of the 5th District, and because TRPA is so specific to the lake, particularly and specifically as a representative to Lake Tahoe constituents. I listen to everyone on that board. I meet with people who are opposed to projects. I meet with people who are in favor of projects. I sit down with county staff and go over the county position, and I would say 99% of the time I probably end up voting the county position. But I am not an automaton. I am not a puppet, and I'm going to continue to stand on principle that when my position diverges from that of the county, I will have to vote my principles. So that's really what I have to say. I hope in the future we have a discussion about the policy, the underlying policy, and maybe come up with a different solution than what we have today. But those are my comments. And I really, again, I thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate your time, and very, very much appreciate your support and everyone else who is not here today.
So, and we're scheduled to be in Lake Tahoe on April 11th. Why don't we then just plan on having another public discussion following the October one up there on TAU specifically, and anything else that might be needed as an update of the regional plan. And then I'll bring this issue back to the board as it relates to item 9A, which is the committee assignments. Is anyone, Jim?
Mr. Chair, I did have one question. This item 9A, covers all the committee and commission appointments. My suggestion would be, because I don't want to impede any committee and commission appointments en masse here, my suggestion, and I believe this would pass the smell test from our county council, would be to pull out the TRPA appointment individually, vote on the rest, and then pull out the TRPA piece for a separate vote, if that would meet with the consent of this board.
We can do that.
Thank you.
Okay. So, Jim?
Is Mr. Sevison prepared to attend tomorrow's TRPA meeting?
Yes.
So how does that work? Is he going to attend if we pull this up?
If we designate, we need to designate the TA. I think Jennifer's just asking that we take separate votes, one for all of the other committee assignments and one specifically to this one, but Larry's prepared to serve tomorrow.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions? What's the pleasure of the board?
Chairman, I would move approval of the those items under 9A that are committee and commission assignments, absent the TRPA committee and commission assignment.
Moved and seconded to approve all committee assignments as discussed 2 weeks ago, with the exception of TRPA. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Mr. Chairman, I move to approve the recommendations of this board as of our January 11th meeting as it relates to the TRPA committee assignments.
For a second? Moved and seconded to approve.
And under discussion on that, if I may, just as you just requested, appropriately so, a bifurcated motion on this, because you had concerns about one committee and commission assignment out of the list, at our October meeting, you could have made it clear to this board by requesting a bifurcated motion that you remove the TAU item, vote on the TAU item separate from everything else. And it would have made it clear to this board what your true concern was, and we could have avoided an awful lot of this.
And that's noted, thank you, and I will certainly do that in the future.
So we have a motion and a second to approve the TRPA committee assignments as discussed 2 weeks ago. Jim?
I haven't heard any objection to Mr. Sevenson's appointment, and he's served the county well for several years, and there's nothing that precludes Supervisor Montgomery from meeting with Mr. Sevenson before any TRPA meeting to express her concerns.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Motion carries 4-1. Thanks. So we also have pulled item 20-something. 21, revenue sharing. Jack?
Yes, just wanted to touch base, seeing that I'm fairly new to the board and the process of formulating my own thoughts on revenue sharing, and for the fact that the portion to District 1 has been exhausted, that maybe this is the right time to have a discussion moving forward with regards to our thoughts on the revenue share. So that's it.
Thanks.
Kirk? Move approval of item 21.
Second.
Moved and seconded to approve item 21. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Abstain. Yeah, abstain.
So we'll go to our department items, and the first one is an update on the 2011-12 proposed budget as per the state status. Holly.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Before we launch into the discussion of state budget impacts, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce a new member of our staff, Graham Knaus, who will be the Finance and Budget Operations Manager. He previously has worked with the Department of Health and Human Services as their Administrative Services Manager, and prior to that was a Senior Fiscal and Policy Analyst with a statewide association. He is responsible for planning and development of the countywide budget, long-range fiscal planning, and development and maintenance of long-range infrastructure plans. I would also note he has his Master of Public Administration from USC and a BA from San Diego State.
Perfect.
So today, he'll be discussing our preliminary look at the statewide budget. Much of that you have heard in the news as to what the implications are and the potential shifts to the county. He'll review that, as well as what more specific potential impacts there are for Placer County. He's worked with our county staff, who has been entrenched in these issues for years, and I think they've done a good job of providing a snapshot for your board. As we move through this budget process with the state, certainly these issues will be refined and more information will be available. But with that, and if Graham would like to rebut anything I've said, I'll give him the opportunity. Thank you, Graham, and welcome.
Well, first of all, welcome, Graham, and want you to know you have huge shoes to fill. The county's budget's in a strong position, and we're probably looking at the biggest structural change prospectively to the state budget that we've seen in the last 20 years, so don't want to put any pressure on you. Since you're a USC grad, I'm sure you ought to it, so go ahead.
I'll just start off by saying, go Trojans. I'll leave the rest alone.
Soon as we're on probation.
I'm out. Well, good morning. As Holly mentioned, I'm Graham Knaus, the Finance and Budget Operations Manager, and I do have the perhaps unfortunate task of coming before you this morning and providing a very gloomy picture related to the state budget. This is the 8th consecutive year whereby the state has had a substantial budget deficit, so there's nothing new there. But the approach is remarkably different from what we've seen over the past several years in a couple of areas that we'll walk through. So I'll go through both the state budget overview and what the local implications are from both the fiscal and a policy perspective to us here, and sort of set the broader context for our 2011-12 local budget that we'll be working through over the coming weeks and months. Bottom line, no surprise to folks in the room or to folks in the public, the state budget creates significant challenges to our ability to manage our own budget locally, given the shifts in responsibilities and some of the reductions to our funding. The new governor, Governor Jerry Brown, walks in the door with a $25.4 billion challenge. That's broken into two different pieces. $8.2 billion hole exists within the current year between now and June 30th, followed by a $17.2 billion gap for the 2011-12 fiscal year. There's roughly a 50-50 split between taxes and cuts and an additional $2 billion in state borrowing that's comprised in the framework of the plan. A bit of a deviation from prior approaches is a very heavy emphasis on solutions that would have a substantial impact to county operations and the level of government that should be providing services. The approach also banks on a June 2011 statewide special election to extend a number of tax increases that were originally approved back in February of 2009. And specifically, that would be a 5-year extension for a 1% increase in the sales tax for $4.5 billion, a 0.25% increase in the personal income tax for $4.8 billion, a 0.5% increase in the vehicle license fee for $1.4 billion, and that funding currently is going towards public safety support, a decrease in the dependent exemption credit from $309 per eligible dependent down to $99 for $1.2 billion in additional state revenue. That whole package, as I mentioned, was originally approved by the legislature back in February of 2009, and this 5-year extension would have substantial implications to us as a primary fund source for some of the governor's larger initiatives, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Other state solutions include suspending most reimbursable mandates, which does have some impact to us here in the county, deferring a number of payments based on the schedule that exists in the current year, whereby for 3 months, July, October, and March, we are asked of the state to continue to do what, well, we are told by the state to continue to do what they want us to do, but the funding will not be coming our way, so we would have to float that impact. A bit of a change from the prior approaches, which have had a very heavy emphasis on mid-year reductions that would occur between the January and March timeframe. Governor Brown, instead of focusing on mid-year reductions, is instead focusing on an expedited process to get an initial 2011-12 budget framework in place. That doesn't provide a lot of time for the legislature. He's giving them about 6 weeks from today to put together an initial framework to allow sufficient time for the June special election. The major cuts included in the budget include eliminating the redevelopment agencies for $1.7 billion savings in 11-12, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a minute. Medi-Cal Reductions, that's the low-income health insurance program in the state, $1.7 billion in scaled-back eligibility and reduced provider payments. The CalWorks Welfare to Work program, a $1.5 billion reduction there, which is targeted towards reducing the benefits for clients, in addition to scaling back eligibility by about 20%. A transportation fund shift of over $1 billion that should be revenue neutral to us here in the county. Higher ed reductions of $1 billion, and a mental health fund shift that would exist in for 1 year only for about $900 million in savings, and that one locally would impact about 400 Placer County families that are currently receiving mental health services. There's a $500 million reduction as well to the in-home supportive services program through scaled back eligibility and services to clients there. On the revenue side, in addition to the package that I previously went through, there's also a change in the way that corporations would work through their taxes with the state that would save or create about $1.4 billion in additional revenue. Currently, corporations can pick how they want to determine what portions of the revenue are California-related versus coming from another state. What the governor is proposing is to have one specific formula that everyone would use, which has the impact of increasing that tax liability for folks. There are two substantial policy changes that the governor is proposing to walk through, that I'll walk through. The first is related to a realignment. The governor is proposing a $10 billion realignment of services from the state to counties over the next 4 years. And to provide a bit of historical perspective, the big realignment that exists today in the health and human services area is $4 billion, took 8 months to put together, and has been in place for 20 years. And it's so complicated that almost nobody understands it. What the governor is doing is upping the ante and multiplying that times 2.5 and trying to put that in place over the next few months. It would be structured in two different phases. First phase, $5.9 billion realignment, which would grow to $7 billion in change in 4 years, and would impact what is broadly defined as public safety. That includes CAL FIRE. It includes the realignment related to adult parole. The remaining portions of juvenile probation would shift from the state to the county. So-called low-level offenders that are currently housed in state prison would shift to the county. There are a number of other law enforcement-related funding. And then in the health and human services area, the child welfare services program that serves abused and neglected children, and the adult protective services program, which serves abused and neglected seniors and dependent adults, along with substance abuse treatment and mental health services. All of those would be realigned 100% from the state to the county. So what does that mean to us here in Placer County? From a public safety perspective, initial estimates were that there are 150 low-level offenders that would move from the state to the county. And George Malem, our jail commander, is actually here this morning. And just to as testament that the details of this have not all been fleshed out, recent clarification from the governor's office suggests that George has communicated to us suggests that the impact may be far greater than the 150 low-level offenders, and he's available to speak to that to the extent that the board would like to discuss that piece a bit further as we move through this. Second, from the adult parolee standpoint, there would be 620 additional parolees that would become county responsibility. From the juvenile offender standpoint, there are only 10 remaining juvenile offenders from Placer County that are currently housed at the state level. And those are, the number is small, but the impacts may be large from a county perspective with respect to probation, because the reason why they're not currently housed in the county is that these are the worst of the worst juvenile offenders that require far more resources to focus on whether housed at the state or the county level. From a fire service perspective, which could be a significant impact to the county, the governor's proposing to significantly expand the local responsibility area that we would be managing, with the promise that there would be sufficient funds to cover our increase in responsibility. My fingers are crossed on that one. And that would likely take months and months to work through in terms of how you redefine what the responsibility areas are. From the child welfare services and adult protective services standpoint, there would be 1,500 local Placer County children that may be impacted by that, and an additional 1,000 abused elderly and dependent adults. The proposal relies on the tax increase extensions to provide the funding for all of these realignment proposals, and this is the case where the details are highly relevant in terms of how this will play out for the county. What the governor is proposing is a permanent increase in the county responsibility for all the things that I just walked through. However, the fund source only exists for 5 years, and that's assuming that the legislature is successful in packaging the tax increase to put before the voters, and then they approve it. At this point, there is no Plan B at the state level in terms of how that would play out, nor exactly what would occur in year 6, when counties may still have the responsibility and the funding may or may not be there. There is a phase 2 related to the realignment, but there are so few details I won't spend too much time going through that today. It's about $3 billion and is linked to federal health reform. The second significant policy change of the governor is related to redevelopment and the approach to economic development more generally. A bit of a mixed bag for us, as we would both be a winner and a loser under this proposal. He's basically proposing to eliminate redevelopment agencies outright, and in doing so would honor the existing contractual and bond obligations that exist, and that's somewhere in the $2 to $3 billion range, depending upon which math you use, and sweep any unencumbered balances that exist, and that amount is probably in the neighborhood of $1 billion to $1.5 billion by the time the legislature works through the process. Remaining funds would be distributed based on existing redevelopment, redevelopment or property tax distribution formulas, and when we get to the second year, to the extent this occurs in the second year, all of the redevelopment that is not ripped off by the state would be distributed based on existing property tax formulas. So the county would get its normal share related to property tax. The governor is also proposing a 55% local taxing authority option that doesn't currently exist for economic development projects, to the extent that local entities would like to utilize that option going forward. The local impact related to that is that clearly it would reduce funding for redevelopment and economic development in this county. It does increase your board's authority and flexibility in terms of how to allocate and prioritize resources that are available, and would put economic development into our normal budgeting process, economic development and redevelopment into our normal budget process, instead of having a dedicated separate fund source in terms of the property tax increment. There are a few additional impacts to the county that I'll walk you through as well. One related to our Veteran Services Department would eliminate all state funding for them at about a $200,000 cut to us. This may be a whoops proposal from the governor, in that they have backed away from that and have indicated support to refund that and to continue to provide that state support, which would require some legislative action over the coming weeks. The Williamson Act, which your board has had some discussion about over the past couple of years, is proposed for permanent elimination. That's about a $50,000 reduction from where we're at today. And finally, the governor's proposing to eliminate all state support for the library, which is about $84,000 to us in the current fiscal year. Now, in that one in particular, I would note that that would be compounded by what would be the third consecutive year of declining dedicated property tax that goes to fund the Placer County Library System. From a cash flow perspective, there, in addition to the delayed payments, there's our mandate reimbursement from things that we paid for more than 6 years ago, which we've been getting nickels and dimes on over the past few years. The governor's proposing to not make that payment in 11-12 and add an additional year on the back end of that. And there is a prospect of IOUs, which have been issued in the past couple of years by the state controller, that could come into play and impact our county cash flow to the extent that there's not expedited legislative action to put some budget solutions in place. So where do we go from here? Clearly there are huge risks to the county, but as an eternal optimist, I would also note that there are some opportunities for us as well. Having a discussion, a transparent discussion about the appropriate level of government to provide services may actually be a good conversation to have, so long as whatever responsibilities we're getting come with sufficient and stable fund source from the state in order to provide those services. At this point, there's likely $30 million in direct funding that could be impacted by the cuts and the governor's proposed realignment. And since there are so few details on a lot of these proposals, that number is likely to fluctuate quite a bit over the coming weeks. Looking out towards where the state is today, there are over 60 legislative hearings that are scheduled over the next 3 weeks alone to vet the governor's budget, which is to communicate that they are taking it very seriously. It's considered a real budget proposal, at least at the moment, and that'll be vetted in the context of what is the standard political context in the legislature. The Democrats have indicated that they want some assurance that the tax increases will go on the ballot prior to making making reductions, which they essentially don't have much support for. And on the flip side of that, the Republicans want assurance that the cuts are going to happen. They want to see them in statute prior to engaging in any discussion about authorizing a public vote related to tax increases. So clearly those two things don't quite integrate, and the question is going to be, can the governor break that logjam which has existed for each of the last 8 years and do it in an expedited time frame where there's only about 6 weeks to pull a full initial budget proposal together. We will be refining the county impacts as the details emerge, and certainly as these proposals evolve through the legislative process, as they inevitably will. And looking forward from a more local perspective, we'll be engaging in discussions with your board over the coming weeks relative to specifically targeted workshops with going through each of our local budget challenge areas as we look to 11-12 in the years ahead. With that, I'll stop the gloomy picture, and I'll put back my optimist hat on for at least for just a moment, and I'm open for any questions that you may have.
Kirk.
If you could, referencing Table 1 on page 84, you've done a nice job of breaking down some of the major expenditure solutions as well as the revenue solutions that are being proposed. There's one line item, savings from state employee compensation reductions of $308 million. Are there any other reductions in state expenditures on payroll and personnel that you're aware of that figure into that $12.5 billion in savings?
Short answer is no.
$308 million reflects for those bargaining units at the state that have not already come to an agreement over the past 12 to 18 months, the aligning them with the agreements that have come into place with the other bargaining units. So it merely aligns those that don't already have a final MOU with those that already have one in place. And from a pension reform or an other state reduction standpoint, there are no substantial proposals related to that this time.
Do you have any idea, in terms of the overall state workforce, number of people employed, is there a proposal to reduce that overall state workforce that might reflect savings somewhere in here that we're not seeing called out as an individual line item?
It's not explicitly incorporated into the budget proposal, but it's implied in several different areas. Related to the realignment, there is an assumption in some of the program areas of about a 25% reduction in state operations, which likely would have the impact would be actualized by the reduction of the state workforce, given that there would be responsibilities that we would be taking on that folks in the state may currently be working through. So there are a few areas where it's implied, but it's not explicit at this point.
So, unlike perhaps, I'm asking a question, like Placer County does every year, where we break out not only our expenditures but our full-time equivalents. Have you seen numbers that the state is proposing for the next 18 months that show full-time equivalents compared to historic full-time equivalents? Have we seen anything that shows whether, in fact, the state is actually proposing to defund positions as we move forward, or are we only seeing so far the call for $308 million in savings based on the assumption that bargaining units will adopt specific proposals?
At this point, it's just the $308 million.
Okay. So when we look at the $12.5 billion in reductions in state spending, only 2.5% of that is attributable to a reduction in the state's cost to actually deliver services on an annual basis. The other 97.5% of this is either a reduction in the benefit received by somebody who's currently receiving a benefit under Medi-Cal or CalWorks or something like that, or simply the reassignment of responsibilities to local governments who undoubtedly will have to increase the size of their workforce in order to absorb these new responsibilities. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So we as taxpayers and the recipients of the services that government at all levels is to provide can then conclude that all we are looking at is a future increase in our overall burden to pay for these services, because there is no associated proposed cut in the cost of providing government services at the state level that will compensate for what we are asking local governments to absorb. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yes. Essentially, the realignment that the governor is proposing is massive in its scope, but would move programs from the state to us. There's not a realignment within the state structure and the state operations that's currently been proposed. The governor has suggested that he's interested in going there. We just haven't seen any proposal that does that.
So then, do we have a projection, given that there is no structural reform being proposed at the state level, that would realign the provision of services, eliminate positions in anticipation of local governments picking up those positions? Have we seen a projection beyond just the next 18 months that show what the state's revenue position is versus their expenditures, given that we're not actually reducing the size and cost of the workforce at the state level, but simply using a one-time relocation of responsibility in order to solve this deficit problem? I mean, does anybody think this is actually still viable long-term?
That's a very good question. I will tell you that the Legislative Analyst Office has suggested that although this may decrease the size of the structural deficit going forward to some degree, part of that is a function of the tax increase extensions.
Of course.
That there would be some level of ongoing structural deficit that would remain, that would need to be addressed in future years, if not sooner.
So overall, across local, state responsibilities, we're going to increase ultimately the number of government employees in order to provide the same level of service and have the recipients of those services receive a smaller benefit. That's really what this budget is balanced on.
That's a fair assessment.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Jim?
I'm concerned about the expansion of state responsibility areas into the local jurisdictions. This is going to have a devastating effect on some of our fire districts that are, right on the margin of bankruptcy now. So is there any mechanism to help those districts out that you know of?
Not that's been identified at this point. The proposal is very slim on the details, and the time. There are two elements of the change in responsibility that are relevant. One of them is purely fiscal. It's take $250 million that the state is currently paying towards the statewide responsibility areas and shift that to counties. That could be done pretty quickly because it's just a shift of dollars, so long as they come to the county. The second piece of that, which gets to your question, is related to expanding the scope of the local responsibility areas, and that will likely take months, if not a full year, to work through within the governor and the legislative process that will exist. From a county perspective, clearly we would be looking for some opportunities in there to ensure that our local independent fire districts, of which there are a couple that you referenced that are struggling, there's some level of protection or recognition that just dumping, expanding our responsibility and saying, well, here's your $10 additional worth of services, here's your $10, that should make it all, make everything whole. That doesn't necessarily translate at a local level in such a clean way that may, in terms of how it might be packaged politically in Sacramento. So there's a lot of details that are highly relevant in terms of how this would play out for the county. And as I indicated, I think there may be some opportunities as well. They just may be few and far between, but there might be some opportunities as well to try to address some of those issues.
Because if it does come to the money flows to the counties, that leaves the special districts out, and that's what happened with Proposition 172. When it went to the voters, there was campaign ads with, firefighters standing in front of blazing forest fires, and the local districts did not get any of the revenue from Proposition 172. So I just want to make sure if you keep me apprised of any movement in that direction, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Jennifer.
Thank you. Following up on Jim's question about fire services specifically, my understanding on the question about what's going to happen with the RDA, the RDAs throughout the county, is that if that money gets swept, it goes into the county general fund. I'm sorry, the state general fund. Is that correct?
The dollars that would get swept in 11-12 would go to the state general fund. That's right.
Now, I also believe that at some point in the future, those will actually revert to the various special districts within counties and cities. Is that also correct?
Yes, it is.
Do we know when that would be in terms of 11, 12, 13, never?
According to the governor's proposal, it would occur in 12-13, so it would be an additional year before that would occur. And for the first year, the dollars that are not swept would stay locally. It's just a lot less than what exists currently.
Right. Okay. And then I recall that under our former governor, there was a proposal for insurance rate hikes, subsidies, supplements for people who lived in the wildland-urban interface, in the WUI, that they would pay in addition. It would be a sort of a additional fee on top of your regular homeowner's insurance. Mm-hmm. Is that still in the works, to the best of your knowledge?
I don't believe that's in this proposal.
Because it's certainly something that I chose to move into the wildland-urban interface. It's a decision that I made when I bought my residence, and I think it's certainly something that, as a state, we might want to look at again, because it just seems like, with my choice to move into a heavily forested area, I take some responsibility for making sure that I have some fire protection, maybe above and beyond some other individuals.
I would think that given that there's been a lot of discussion about that over the past couple of years, and it has been, as you referenced, it's been proposed a couple of times, it's likely to come up in the legislative process, but I'm not aware
part
of
of this proposal.
I don't believe it's part of that proposal.
Okay, and then on a slightly different topic, also relating actually to redevelopment, however, is you mentioned this proposal for a new local taxing authority that would require only a 55% voter approval for these limited tax increases. When you say local, how local is that? Do we have an idea? Is it county-wide vote? Is it within the redevelopment agency areas only?
That's a marvelous question. I'm not sure what the answer, how that's been worked out.
Okay, thank you. I would like to get an answer to that at some point in the near future.
Tom?
Just to clarify a couple of questions, and thank you, Graham, that's a lot of information to put forward. Back first to the fire issue, is that the proposal on that is to have the Board of Forestry develop regulations about the state responsibility areas. So that'll end up, that's the vehicle by which the state responsibility areas would propose to be shrunk, and call it that, and then local responsibilities come into play. When you're looking at the wherewithal for funding of that, no, there's been no discussion about resurrecting at this stage the tax on insurance policies, if you want to describe it that, although it had some interesting discussions last couple of years. When you look at the pass-through on redevelopment funds, the first year of those monies are essentially designated for the court system. So any of if redevelopment agencies have ceased to exist, the monies that would be freed up that year go to the Superior Court system, so the state reduces its obligation to fund those. That's kind of the first part of that. The other thing that's important to consider is that in the governor's proposal, special districts which have the ability to charge, that get part of property tax dollars, especially water districts come to mind, or those who provide water services like community service districts that do that service, or sewer districts, they would not get that property tax increment back, because the premise on that is that they can just charge a rate increase, and so the property tax is not needed that. And that's been kind of a current theorem on the state level for some time. I think there was a proposal a couple years ago to eliminate all property taxes going to special districts of that nature, and then those monies would have gone to fund probation services, was the last time that surfaced. So there's a little bit of spin on a couple of those items, a lot of details missing. I do want to let you know that the California Association of Counties is diligently following this. They're looking at what they call all their affiliates, the welfare directors, et cetera, on down the line are looking at technical aspects. I think CSAC recognizes that whether it's county execs or it's Board of Supervisors, it's really in the details of what the regulations are. So they're hoping that the affiliates in this extremely short period of time are able to look at the actual rules crafted, that they can be implemented and they reduce state costs in terms of what the state has to do. It won't do Placer County good to have the state of California sit back, give us services, even with funding, and then tell us how to provide every last service down to the state's direction. So that's being worked at. The other big item for the counties is that there needs to be a constitutional guarantee of future revenue, or no longer the counties being responsible after that 5 years. And that's a very difficult thing, because that requires both sides of the legislature to ensure that that goes on the ballot. And so a lot of extremely important technical things need to be done. Incredibly short period of time to do it. I think you did a good job of analyzing or summarizing what the last realignment shift was and how long it took. I think the greatest fear is that there's just not enough time to get it technically put together in the right way, even for the voters to consider it. But I thought your board might bear hearing some of that additional detail.
Thanks, Tom. Jack?
Yes, Graham, just a quick question on the $600 million that's being shifted back with regards to adult and juvenile offenders. Are there any considerations for, my thought is that if we have responsibilities coming back, that may increase the need for beds. Are there any discussions with regards to funding for OR and additional surveillance of offenders for early release?
Not as incorporated into the governor's proposal, but they very well may come up as part of the legislative process as they deliberate on what the impacts may be locally, and I'm sure our probation department and Steve Pcwa and other folks would be plugged into that and participating both from a county perspective and through our associations, as Tom referenced, in terms of this Association of Counties and the Chief Probation Officers Association.
If I might just step in there real quick to follow up on that, is that we do have an empty wing because of how probation has been managing the juvenile population and the success of working with HHS, and I think we have actually a lower than average incarceration rate of juveniles because of the success of our Health and Human Services and probation. To open up that wing is $1.4 million a year. The difficulty, I think, that Graham summarized, that the 10 individuals coming back are not the general population of juvenile defendants, so it is a much more intensive type of work. And so it'll be interesting to see what kind of funding comes back, but it will absorb more probation resources to segregate out that population. It's very unlikely to be on OR or other alternative sentencing because of the nature of the crimes that they had committed that led to state incarceration.
Kirk. Would you expound upon, please, that I jotted down a note that you said that the state was going to be willing, I believe, if I got it correct, to essentially absorb and honor the existing bonded indebtedness created by the redevelopment agencies of approximately $2 to $3 billion. Is that correct?
Yes. So to the extent that existing redevelopment agencies are either have dollars tied to contractual obligations or bonding, or is bonded against, those obligations would be honored. The mechanism by which the governor is proposing to incorporate to do that would be to eliminate the existing redevelopment agencies and then basically create sort of a new one that would just deal with those obligations. And so those dollars would be set aside and would go to the same purpose they're going to now. And then to the extent that there was any new project, they would work through the proposal is that we would work through our local budget process to fund that, or through the local taxing approach to the extent that that's viable.
But ultimately, or originally, I should say, the individual debt that cumulatively adds up to $2 to $3 billion was sold in smaller increments by jurisdictions who had to achieve bond ratings and therefore associated interest rates with those bonds, correct? And now they're talking about taking all of those together and backing them with the full faith and credit of the state of California, as opposed to, whatever interest rate we in Placer County might have been forced to pay by virtue of our rating, or Los Angeles County. Now, am I understanding that correctly? You're taking all of those different bonded indebtedness obligations that each have their associated interest rate that they pay on that debt, combining them together at the state level, and now it's the state that's responsible for making sure that that gets repaid?
Let me take a stab at that. Again, details are shockingly absent. But the theory is it would still be managed by your Board of Supervisors in terms of our redevelopment agencies. It's just that it would only be the payoff of the existing debt. And so even like you do have bonds issued in one particular instance that I'm aware of, those bonds still have the same interest rate. We still have the same requirement. You would still keep up that aspect of the increment tax that goes to those till those bonds are paid off. They would keep that at a local level because it'd be a massive, otherwise, for the state to take on to that, it'd be a massive refinancing, whole different interest rates, just unscrambling contractual agreements, which are about impossible to do.
Well, then what is this? And maybe I'm misheard something, but in terms of the state honoring the existing bond debt, what did that mean?
I think they will recognize contractually they can't touch that from a legal perspective. And so
okay.
they would recognize that we already have that existing
Okay.
bond debt.
And
And so they would take whatever was not obligated, and that's why you see so many jurisdictions talking about contractually.
Okay, all right.
I would suggest it's not generous on their part.
No.
It's simply a recognition of the United States Constitution. So
Right,
you can't impair
right.
existing
And that's what I was wondering is how would the state then have the authority to step in and essentially usurp those contracts, those investment contracts between the people who underwrote the bonds and that local jurisdiction?
I would suggest the bonds will be the easiest part to deal with.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, because they're pretty clear, and
Right.
you just wind up with how you're going to administer them afterwards. And I think you're right, Tom, that they're going to be at the local level. It's the other contracts,
Right.
which may be more questioned by the state, and we spend more time talking about, is that really a contract? Is that something else than a contract?
But then in terms of our board's ability, as we sit as the redevelopment agency, which we will today, in terms of our board's ability under this proposed scenario to create future debt obligations by way of bonding, that essentially disappears under this proposal. So for instance, the Sunset Industrial area, should we decide that we wanted to create bonded indebtedness in order to advance infrastructure to get people in there and jobs and all the rest, that's gone. We don't have that ability under this proposal. Correct?
Except for this yet-to-be-defined mechanism by 55% of the vote, could
Okay.
conceivably full county, less than county, or
Right.
redevelopment areas.
Okay, thank you.
Supervisor Euler, perhaps instead of honoring existing obligations, I should have used the Graham on the street translation, which is the state won't steal it because they can't.
Jim?
Getting back to the redevelopment agency funds that will go into the general fund, state general fund, it's my understanding the majority of those funds will be spent on education. Am I correct in that?
From a redevelopment standpoint, in the first year, as Tom alluded to, the dollars that the state would rip off would go to two places. One is to the courts, and the second is to backfill for state costs in the Medi-Cal program. There is going forward a benefit to school districts in that they would have property tax that would be distributed to them via the normal property tax distribution that currently goes only towards redevelopment agencies. And statewide, that's about $1 billion beginning in 12-13.
Okay. And then I have another comment. I just wanted to make sure that Captain Milam has a chance to speak to us regarding the effects of the county jail system when he has a chance. So.
And I just, was that it, Jim?
Yeah.
As we go forward, as we always have, I think, and which has served us well, to keep an eye on with these prospective realignments, looking at the long-term revenue streams that would accompany them or lack thereof, and the long-term cost bias that will occur to provide perhaps greater services. So, for example, in my opinion, one of the problems with the state of California is that we have an extraordinarily progressive income tax structure, which during dot-com booms and the such provide huge revenue sources, but it's an extraordinarily volatile revenue source. And so I think we need to be very careful here that as we prospectively assume greater responsibilities, we have a good understanding of what's going to happen to those prospective revenue sources and the volatility related to them. I think I'll leave it at that at this point.
The proposal would use the same revenue sources that currently fund the $4 billion Health and Human Services realignment that I referenced, vehicle license fee and sales tax. A couple pieces to note related to that. One, over the course of that full realignment, if you don't look at it on a per-year basis, it generally has worked from a funding standpoint, except for the last 3 years. And as we stand today, prior to even engaging in a discussion about a second realignment, counties are currently owed $600 million to pay for the cost of responsibilities that have been shifted to us in the first realignment. So we're already owed $600 million due to the declining sales tax and vehicle license fee revenues over the past 3 years.
Thanks. Well, with that, welcome again, Graham, and
can we go back to USC?
And with that, we'll hear about our prospective jail impacts.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, thank you. I wish I had better news and was just presented, but I don't. Originally, the information I provided to the CEO's office on how this realignment would affect the jails was incorrect. It was going on the assumption, as many of us jail managers were, that it was a Schwarzenegger plan. People sentenced to state prison for 3 years or less would get shifted down to the county jails. At last week's Northern California Jail Managers meeting, a representative from Corrections Standards Authority straightened us all out on that. And the DA's office provided me with some statistics to or some numbers to be able to show you how this will impact us. Basically, how it works is they're what they call the 3 nons. What will wind up back in county jails are nonviolent, non-sexual, non-serious offenders, regardless of length of sentence. Those 3 terms, those 3 nons, have yet to be defined, and it's unknown whether the legislature is going to go with those definitions as they exist in the penal code now, or whether they're going to redefine them. My guess is they may redefine them because they're pretty restrictive right now. So based on the numbers provided from the DA's office, and I removed the attempted murders, the serious sexual and violent offenses from the list, there are 347 folks sentenced to state prison over the last 2 years for what we can best estimate are the 3 nons. The average length of that sentence was 3.9 years. The sentences range from 1 year up to, I believe it was 40 years. There are 125 folks sentenced in that time period to more than 3 years. So how that impacts us is in about 2 years I'll have 347 people that normally would be in state prison occupying the bed space at either the Auburn Jail or South Placer, depending on what happens with South Placer. Coupled with the 545 inmates that I have had as average daily population over the last 2 years, that brings us up to about 892 inmates after 2 years. We'll be under capacity of 646 now in Auburn. We are still we'll be under the federal consent decree, which means we'll have to start releasing people to make room and obviously try to leave about a 10% bed vacancy. And those people that we'll be releasing will probably be a higher classification than we've released in the past, just because of the classification that we're having to accept from the state prisons. So pre-sentenced and sentenced folks would be released. Obviously, there will be some room, I think, in alternative sentencing programs for them, but a lot of those folks that would be released under that plan don't qualify for alternative sentencing right now, so there'll have to be some adjustments to that. So there's a higher level of and more sophisticated criminal being released to the street. What this doesn't take into account is the compounding effect of the fact that people will be doing more than 3 years. The average sentence is 3.9 years, but again, there's 125 folks sentenced in that time period to over 3 years, which means as you get into more years, people are going to stay 8, 10, 12 years, best as we can tell, and then we'll be taking up beds for a very long time and put us in a position also of where the state has security housing units. We don't necessarily have those kinds of things, and we'll have to make do with what we have to try to classify these folks and separate them so they don't go at each other or at our staff. Under one of the current options for opening the South Placer facility, we would have a capacity of 388 in Auburn. In other words, we'd pare back operations in Auburn and try to open or run South Placer at its full capacity, or at 390. That would be a total of 778 beds, give us a 10% vacancy operating capacity, or 10% vacancy rate and operating capacity of 700. The 347 inmates estimated to be serving their time in county jail instead of state prison would represent 50% of that operating capacity, with Auburn open partially and South Placer open fully. If we operate both facilities fully, we would have a rated capacity of 1,036, and this includes keeping both minimum security male barracks open in Auburn as they exist now. Allowing a 10% vacancy rate in both facilities, our operating capacity would be 932. The 347 inmates would represent 37% of that operating capacity. And again, that 347 would tend to increase over time as we get people sentenced to more than 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years. The understanding is, based on VLF being continued and the sales tax being continued, that money now funds certain programs, cop supplemental law enforcement, as well as, I believe, rural cops, where we can hire folks and do maintenance to our facilities without general funds. If that were to pass, that money would be shifted to the state, and then they would give us $25,000 a year per inmate for how long they stayed. That equates to $68 and about 17 cents a day, which is less than the defined daily jail rate now. It's about $9 or $10 less per day, and even that doesn't cover our actual costs. So this is going to be a pretty big hit for us, as well as a threat, I think, to the public safety of the people in Placer County because of the higher level of people we're going to have to release. And then this does not even address the fact that the Supreme Court still has to rule on whether the state needs to release 40 or 50,000 inmates to the street, which may happen. And my guess is it has. The state's had over 20 years, over 2 decades to deal with these issues, and they haven't done it. So I don't know that they're going to find too much sympathy with the Supreme Court. And the other side of this coin, too, is yes, once persons are released from state prison, they would come to their county residence to do their probation time. When they violate, if they were to violate, and they were violating on their probation, instead of going back to state prison to serving that time, they would be coming back to county jail to serve their time. So that, again, compounds the number of people we would have in custody. I wish I had brighter news for you on this. The 274 folks over 2 years doesn't look so bad now, but the reality is this is what they're proposing, and barring, if obviously the tax increases, the extension of those don't pass, as was said, there is no plan B. And as the undersheriff had mentioned to me, hope is not a plan or a strategy. And this is kind of what they're hoping on. So what happens, I don't know if it doesn't pass, if they have other options in mind, but I think it's been clear to us in corrections for quite a few years that the state is doing everything they can to push the burden back on the counties. And whether that comes with money or not, all depends, I guess, on the voters at this time. Are there any questions? Kirk.
Perhaps I misheard. Could you clarify the number of inmates we're expecting that we will actually have to absorb from the state?
Best estimates based from the numbers from the district attorney's office right now, without knowing exactly how the 3 nons are going to be defined, is 347 in 2 years.
Okay. That was what I thought I heard. So California being approximately 1% of the state's population, I'm assuming that means that statewide we're looking at about 34,000, 35,000 inmates that will be directed back to local jurisdictions. Is that fair?
It's a fair assumption. However, in larger counties, these folks might not have gotten state prison time anyways. They might have gotten county jail time or probation. It all depends on their probation department, but that is a fair estimate. Okay. And again, the average sentence that we have is 3.9 years for those folks.
Okay. So approximately 35,000 people will be transitioning from State Department of Corrections to local jail facilities. Do you know what the approximate population currently is of state inmates?
They are at about 150 to 70% of capacity, I believe. And they're, I want to say, well over 180,000 or something like that at this point.
180,000, so
yes.
35 represents about 19% of the state population then that would be coming back. Can we assume then that there is a reduction in expenditures at the Department of Corrections of 18 and 19% that correlates with that reduction in responsibilities?
It all depends on how far they bring down their numbers. If they bring it below their rated capacity, there could be some savings in staffing. I believe they're kind of understaffed for the amount of population they have now and what they're using. I think the governor's long-term position may be to cut back on those expenditures, to put more back on the counties and therefore require less inmates in state prison. But my assumption would be that CCPOA would definitely push against that very hard.
Do we know, maybe this is a question for Graham, do we know if the governor's budget right now, as presented, proposes a reduction in State Department of Corrections expenditures roughly equivalent to the reduction in the inmate population?
I don't believe there's any proposed reduction to the Department of Corrections at this time. There's significant legislative interest in going there, but they haven't talked through it yet. I believe there are upcoming hearings on that very question.
I didn't think so. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Thank you. Okay, unless there are any questions or comments, we will move to our first timed item, 10:30, which is presentation regarding redistricting as a result of our latest census. And Holly, you're going to present that to us?
Good morning again, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. With me, Holly Heinzen with the County Executive Office. With me today are Lauren Clark, the Assistant Director of CDRA, and Michael Johnson, the Director of Community Development Resource Agency, as well as Gloria Coots from the Clerk Recorder's Office. Today we are here before you to seeking direction to initiate efforts for redistricting Placer County supervisorial districts in accordance with state law and federal census. As you know, every 10 years, the law requires that account be taken of everyone residing in the United States. Information from that census is used to help determine where to locate schools, daycare, and redraw legislative boundaries in accordance with population shifts. In addition, here at the local level, it provides the opportunity to realign supervisorial district boundaries to reflect changes in population. As you all know, we've seen very large increases in population in Placer County over the last 10 years. In fact, since 2000, it's increased about 40% overall. About 100,000 people. So within Placer County, those boundaries take on significant importance. Most of our growth has occurred in South Placer. The California Elections Codes provides basic criteria for redrawing those boundaries. The Voting Rights Act basically provides for consideration of a number of factors, including topography, geography, communities of interest, compactness of the territory, and cohesiveness. The development of the new boundaries may be done by the board itself or by a supervisorial redistricting commission. Staff is before you today to recommend that staff proceed to provide alternatives for consideration by your board for redrawing those boundaries. The redistricting that occurred with the 2000 census basically provided that staff prepared a series of boundary maps for consideration by the board. The board subsequently directed staff to review those boundaries with the municipal advisory committees, which were then 13, to seek input and provide information to the public. In addition, our county clerk recorder was instrumental in meeting with a range of school districts, cities, and other entities who had interest in how those boundaries might be drawn. For the upcoming redistricting effort, we're anticipating that the census data will be received about the end of March. At that time, the information would still need to be sorted and aligned with our own county systems. Again, we would recommend that the board consider those alternatives that I previously described: topography, cohesiveness, integrity and compactness of the territory, and community of interest. In addition, we would recommend that the board consider existing census and precinct lines just as a means of efficiency. It's not that they would dictate how those alternatives be considered, but that it makes sense to draw them along some of our existing boundaries. We're proposing that with the March 30th receipt of the census data, assuming we get it by then, in April would be the analysis of census data and population by district. In April and May, we would be providing alternatives for consideration by your board and holding some board workshops. In June and July, the community input and municipal advisory council review would occur. In August, a board workshop. And then in August and September, we would be holding public hearings. I would note that a public hearing is required, or actually 2 public hearings are required, one as a public hearing and one for adoption. The effort needs to be concluded no later than November 1st, assuming it's a staff-directed effort. With that, I would entertain any questions or look to my colleagues here if there's any additional information they feel may need to be added.
Questions? Board members?
Yeah, Holly, as I look at the staff report, seems to indicate 3 options for moving this forward. The board itself is one option.
Yes.
Or a supervisorial redistricting commission, which then specifies who the participants are. And then the third alternative is a quote-unquote committee composed of residents of the county to study the changing of the boundaries of supervisorial districts.
Yes, that is correct. Those options are provided in the law for providing for those boundaries.
So into which of those 3 categories does having staff draw the boundaries fall?
That would be contained under the board-directed option.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So under that option, you're not saying that the board necessarily sit down in public session and say, no, the line goes here and the line goes there. That by us directing staff, that's the board doing it?
That would be the board mechanism. And let me just clarify, in prior years, the board staff actually was the lead in drawing those boundaries. So as an extension of the board. So I appreciate you making that clarification.
Thank you.
And Jennifer.
Holly, what are the implications for other entities like PCWA? For example, I know that Supervisorial District 5 and PCWA District 5 share the same boundaries. What happens with PCWA and what happens with that process?
Yes, certainly with PCWA, because they have boundaries that are coterminous with the boards, those districts would, and those elected officials would be considered in terms of how those boundaries are drawn. I mean, we would give that consideration, of course. Those are the only boundaries that are coterminous with the board's district that I'm aware of, and I don't know, yeah. So, yes, certainly that's an important point, and PCWA will have interest in this as well.
But I would add to that, every district and city has the same obligation your board has to redistrict within it if they have districts. So,
Jim.
Oh, I just wanted to point out that I think that when PCWA board was originated, it was along the county supervisorial district lines.
Yes, it was. And as most of you may know, previously PCWA was actually a part of the county, and in the 70s split to be an independent board. But the charter calls for, it's not a charter, the legislation, enacting legislation, has them coterminous with the Board of Supervisor boundaries.
Jack.
Yes, if the board decides to be consistent with what has occurred in the past with regards to redistricting, what is the degree and level of public input and opportunities for public input in the process?
Yeah, certainly it can be whatever the board so directs, and we're seeking that direction today. What we're proposing is a similar approach to what occurred 10 years ago. One, that we would be coming to your board with workshops where you would be first evaluating a number of alternatives. We're thinking about 3. And then that would go out to the public. We're using the municipal advisory councils, not because they serve specific areas, but because they serve as a good mechanism to get the information out to the public, and they are existing venues. So it really does, and they stretch throughout the county. So we think that's incredibly important. Previously, Mr. McCauley, our county clerk recorder, did visit all of the cities and special districts a variety of special districts that noted interest and provided information to those entities as well. And certainly, we will conduct outreach to the extent that those entities are interested in some of those informational presentations.
Okay, is there anyone from the public who would like to address the board on this issue? Oh, I'm sorry, Jennifer. Go ahead.
Sorry, just following up on Jack's question. So the public outreach then would be 14 max. The Board of Supervisors updates and various and sundry actions along this process, that there would be an opportunity for the public to participate in all of those. But then additionally, at least 2 other public meetings, is that correct?
Yes. First, we would go to the board in, I'm going to say, late March at the earliest and into April with a set of alternatives for your board to consider, and that would be a public meeting. We would then go to the max. We would again hold a Board of Supervisor workshop in August, as to refine those alternatives or narrow them down. And then in August, probably September, the Board of Supervisors required public hearings. So there will be a number of opportunities throughout the process for the public to weigh in, to be provided information, and for your board to receive feedback as to what you think are the important elements to be considered.
Thank you.
Anyone from the public wish to address this issue? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the board? Staff is seeking direction to essentially replicate the 2001 experience, plus do outreach to the cities, school districts, and special districts.
I would move that we follow the staff recommendation here and include representatives from planning, clerk recorder elections, county council, and office of the county executive to develop alternatives for the board's consideration.
Moved and seconded to essentially follow staff recommendation on replicating the 2001 process for redistricting. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
So we'll go back to our department items. Number 4, which is lost here or something. It's a report on CalPERS, miscellaneous and safety pension plans, Therese Leonard and Ann Craig.
We just want to bring happy news all the way.
More stuff.
More stuff. We just can't fill enough.
Stuff business. Therese.
Good morning, Chairman Wygant, members of the board. Therese Leonard with the County Executive Office. I'm joined today by Ann Craig, Personnel Services Manager and Resident Benefits Expert. Unlike the State of California budget, which is in the hundreds of billions of dollars and has absolutely no detail, we are here to present to you today the 2 actuarial reports we received from CalPERS on our pension plans, and there is nothing but detail in these reports. The County of Placer manages 2 pension plans, one for miscellaneous and one for safety. Essentially, right now we have 2 platforms that we are operating under. The platform for current employees is considered a vested benefit, and when you're in labor negotiations, it's not something that you can negotiate away. Recently, the Board of Supervisors adopted a second tier, if you will, which is a second platform for new hires, and that will be effective after March 12, 2011. The second tier is a prospective measure. It is expected to help the county avoid significant growth in our liabilities into the future. So there are going to be very small savings in the short term, because you actually have to bring employees in to be on the platform in order to start seeing some real savings. It will be years before material savings will be actualized in the reports that we come to your board every year and talk about. The biggest reason for that is because the current unfunded liability in the actuary is amortized or spread over a 30-year period, which means it's going to take a while just to get past where we are right now. So the current employees have a platform of, if you're in safety, 3% at age 50. If you're in miscellaneous, it would be 2.5 at age 55. This benefit is calculated on the one-year average salary, which is typically the highest salary. The new hires that would be effective after March 12th are on a little bit lower level of benefit. It essentially was a step back from where we were to where we went, and now we're going backwards for the new hires. So essentially, safety will be 3% at age 55, and miscellaneous would be 2% at age 55. In addition to that, this benefit will be calculated on a 3-year average, which in effect reduces the pension amount. So as we look at these two reports today, they are back in time. The report actually is through June 30th, 2009, even though we just received the report, and it is to create a charge, if you will, a PERS charge for the 11-12 budget cycle. So bear in mind that everything that we're talking about today is 2 years old. Take it with a grain of salt, because it probably doesn't feel like what's going on in the world today. So the safety plan right now has 842 participants, and it's made up of a series of folk, active employees, folks that have retired, folks that have vested but they're separated from employment and may have gone to work for another agency pending retirement. It includes deputies that are sworn officers, probation officers, correctional officers, and DA investigators. The miscellaneous plan, which is 2.5 at 55, has 5,286 participants, a much larger group of people, active employees, retired, transfers as well. And essentially it covers everybody that's not in the safety plan. So in order to be eligible for retirement, you have to be at least age 50 and have 5 years of service credit, can be with the county or with any other CalPERS agency, a combination of years. The pension formula is set. It is a calculation based on a benefit factor, which we'll talk about in a minute, the number of years of service that the employee has, and their Percival Compensation. Again, based on whichever tier the employee would be on, it would either be calculated on a 1-year or a 3-year average. So benefit factors are important, and one of the reasons why I put this chart in the presentation is to show the distinction between the current employee platform and the new hire platform, because this really will affect our future liability as a county, the costs to the county as we move forward in the budget cycle, as well as the impact to the employees. Under the current miscellaneous formula, at the age of 55, the benefit factor is at its highest point at 2.5% for the calculation. Our current safety, it would be at age 50 that they would get to their maximum, which is 3%. Under the new platform, at age 55, a miscellaneous employee would only have a 2% benefit factor and would in fact have to work to be at age 63 to get even close to that 2.5 benefit factor. Under safety, the new formula would be in effect at age 55, 3%. And as you can see, if they retire at age 50, which is eligibility, They just have a lower benefit factor in the calculation. Percival Compensation. This is important because you hear a lot in the news about what's been going on with pension spiking and what is being included in Percival Compensation. Just right out the gate, overtime is not Percival Compensation. Lump sum payments for vacation, sick leave are not Percival Compensation. They essentially relate to paid time, wage base, vacation, holiday time that's paid, and then special pays that are paid to several of our employees. Certificates, the deputies receive posts, which is either 5, 10, or 15%. A wellness incentive, uniform allowances, those are Percival Compensation. So when we look at the two platforms that we're on for current employees and prospective employees, I put the formulas in, and I've assumed an age of 55 for miscellaneous because that's where the maximum benefit can be realized. Essentially, it's a 23% reduction in the pension formula for the same number of years in service. That is why the county will save money prospectively, because the liabilities will not grow as fast. Assuming that, based on the current actuarial reports, that folks are living well into their 80s, if somebody retired at age 50, 55, you're carrying that pension for a long time. So the reduction will really help support our pension plan into the future. Same thing with the safety example. The maximum benefit is received at age 50, so that's how the calculation is done. Again, it's a 23% pension reduction. So how do we fund the pension plans that we have currently? Every year we receive these actuarial reports from CalPERS. They tell us how much of a percent of salary that we should charge as we move through the budget cycle. This year we actually received 3 years' worth of information, what is going to be in 11-12, 12-13, and 13-14, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. There's actually two rates that are included. One is the employer rate, and this one is variable. It changes with demographics, it changes with assumptions, it changes with experience, and that one is what we call the employer rate. It's been going up every year. We expect it to continue to go up. It is the one that actually absorbs the shock, if you will, of what's going on in the economy. The second rate is the employee rate, and that is fixed by law, and it's tied to whatever formula that your employees are under. So, for example, the 3% at 50 formula for safety officers, the employee rate is 9%. That will not change. It will always be 9% for that formula. And for the miscellaneous, it is 8% for the 2.5% at 55. So what we know is that CalPERS had kind of a rough year back in 2008, 2009, and many articles have been written about a 24% investment portfolio loss during that year. It's not just CalPERS. The entire economy was shifting at that time. One of the points of clarification is, yes, they had a 24% loss that year, but actuarial reports are based on a 7.75% growth in their investment portfolios. So the impact to the portfolio is much larger than just the 24%. That will start affecting rates starting in 11-12. Did not affect the 10-11 rates, will start in 11-12. Again, everything's like 2 years behind in CalPERS. The other thing that occurred is they updated their experience study. The last study that they completed was back in 2004. It covered a 10-year period up through 2002. As you look back over time, there has been a huge change in the dynamic of retirement and what's been happening in the economy in the last decade. The prior experience study created the assumptions that actuarial reports had been under from that point forward. Now we have a new study. It studied from 2007 back 10 years. This was an important period of time. A number of things happened that we'll talk about in a minute. So they revised their assumptions for this report moving forward. And essentially what they discovered, looking at this, is that life expectancy is longer post-retirement. The average male is living 1 year longer, the average female is living about 3 months longer. That will affect the rates and assumptions moving forward. What they're seeing is that folks are retiring earlier than they had that previous decade. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with the change in the portfolio platforms that came into play in about 2002. And we'll look at that in a minute. The other thing that they hadn't factored in was salary at this level. They always have been factoring in an inflation value. They always have been looking at step or merit increases. What they hadn't recognized was the fact that in the later years of employment, that folks were promoting and receiving wage increases that would affect an actuarial report. Now they're taking that into consideration, and that's going to affect the rates as well. One thing that is not included in this actuarial report, but will be included in the next one, is a gain in the market after the 8-9 year, which in 9-10 we actually had a 13.3% gain. And I'm going to tell you the effects of that as we move through the presentation. It did not solve our problem. I guess I just say that right up front. It did not solve our problem. So one of the things that CalPERS has done this year, which I strongly applaud, is that they have been actually going out and doing webinars on the experience study so that local agencies, state agencies, schools can actually understand when they get the reports what it means and what's been happening. And so the Chief Deputy Actuary actually did a webinar, and there were some really startling pieces of information in the report. I actually have the website at the bottom of your page if you're interested. Again, the devil's in the details with an actuary. It's about 70 pages long, but it's really fun reading if you're interested. So essentially, the assumptions for this experience study will affect this report moving forward and probably will for the next 10 years. This is the first time data was available for what they call AB 616 platforms, and that's because they went into effect in January 2002. When they did the last study, none of the history, none of the data was available to study those, and so they grouped them into the larger plans that were available at that time. Now, from 2002 through 2007, they were actually able to dig into them and look at them a little bit more minutely, and that gave them better detail to build better assumptions. One very interesting conclusion that came out of the study, and I'm bringing it to your attention because it came up a number of times at other workshops that we've done, is that, the question of, does a safety employee have a shorter life expectancy than a miscellaneous employee, post-retirement? And I'm going to emphasize post-retirement. There's been a lot of stuff going on in the news in the last 30 days about officers being harmed on the street in their stations. But post-retirement, based on this study, what has been found is that safety actually live longer than miscellaneous, slightly longer, and there's a whole section in the report that speaks to that. So, again, there's two rates that get collected through the budget process. The employer-paid rate, again, that's the variable one, and that's the one I want to speak to first. It's a large portion of what we pay towards total comp for an employee. And as you can see, in our current budget, we're paying over 24% for a safety employee and 15% for miscellaneous. That is just the employer portion. Next fiscal year, based on the fact that the investment portfolio went down and the experience study, and it's a combination effect, essentially, that's going to impact it, our rates are going to go up 3 to 4%, somewhere in there. And what I would emphasize is that the majority of the increase is actually from the changes in the assumptions from the experience study. Our folks are living longer, so it just is costing more. But greater than half is costing the safety increase, and a little bit less than that for the miscellaneous. What we know is that rates are going to increase into the future. The other component of this is the employee paid rates, and essentially for safety it's 9% and for miscellaneous it's 8%. Under the new platform for new hires, because the miscellaneous platform went to 2% at age 55, that will be a 7% employee rate. The true savings to a county's operations or to a county's budget comes from the employee picking up and paying their share of the employee rate. However, as we look back in time and we look at what was happening across the state, across the nation, through labor negotiations, when the economy was good, part of the total comp that was being negotiated had to do with the employer starting to pick up a percentage of the employee's rate. And so what you will find if you do any kind of study with other agencies in the state is that rarely did any, and right now, rarely does any employee pick up 100% of their pension cost related to their employee rate. There's usually some kind of mix between the employer paying some of it and they paying some of it. So in 1986, the county paid 3.25% of the employee's rate for miscellaneous, which at that time was a 7% rate. When we moved into 2004, that was a change in the formula where we went from 2% at 55 to 2.5% at 55. The employee rate, because of the formula change, went from 7% to 8%. The employees started to pick up that 1% increase. Since that time, we've been somewhat in a downturn from the economy, and through new labor negotiations, we've been looking at more of a cost sharing towards the pension. For that reason, and also because the employer rate has been going up substantively over that time period as well. And so in 2009 and 2011, rates for cost sharing have gone down, and it was reduced to 6% for DSA miscellaneous and 6% for PPO miscellaneous. So if the rate was 8%, and we're paying as a county for the employee 6%, the employees started picking up 2%. So the majority of our employees are currently on that platform. And what I wanted to point out is why on a miscellaneous, the employer rate was about 15%. We are paying about 21.157% for every miscellaneous employee on every dollar of Percival Compensation, and the employee pays 2%. For management, confidential, and elected, it's 7%, and the county pays 22%. However, under the new platform, that will change. And again, the biggest budget savings to the county comes with the employee paying the employee's share of the contribution. So under PPEO, where we were unable to negotiate for the change in the platform, they are being held relatively whole, even as new hires. They will be on a different pension platform, but we will continue to pay 6% towards their employee contribution, and new employees will only pay 1%. Management, confidential, and elected, they will pick up 100% of their employee contribution. Miscellaneous DSA, again, will pick up 100% of their contribution, which is 7%. Safety plan, same type.
I think you need to go back to that slide just to make sure you're stating it correctly. The employee will pick up all of the employee contribution, both on DSA, management, confidential, correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Okay.
Safety plan, similar mirror, same economy, same negotiations. And again, in 2009, 2011, reductions were made in the county share of the pickup of the employee, and greater cost sharing was seen by the employee. Again, the safety plan is significantly more expensive. So the county pays about 29.989% for PPEO safety, a little higher for safety management because we pay 100% of their employee share, which is 9%. So that one's at almost 34%. And DSA, they pick up 2%, and we pay about 31%. And they're all outlined on your sheets. I don't really want to go a whole lot into the detail. The point is that the county is substantially paying for the pension benefit that our employees enjoy, and that we have shifted into the future prospectively where new employees will be paying their costs. And if you look at the chart, what you'll see is that The blue line is safety employer and employee costs. That's what we're paying. If we had not negotiated to pick up the employee share of the contribution, it would be the red line. And same thing for miscellaneous. The pink line is what we're actually paying. The green line is what we would have been paying if we weren't paying the employee's contribution. Key to this is that you'll notice huge dips back down in like 2000, 2001. Our portfolio was very well funded. The rates were very low. It was pretty much universal in the state of California. Many agencies were negotiating for cost sharing at this point because it made sense. We weren't paying very much. It was cheap at that point. It's gotten more expensive now, but it was cheap at that point. So that's why they were negotiated, and then the costs have gone up since that time. So when we look at the miscellaneous plan, unique this year is that in December of 2007, the county invoked a hiring freeze. This is the first time it's starting to show up in our actuarial reports. And from 2006 to 2008, active employees went up, and then in 2009, it actually drops for the very first time by 132 employees. Wage rates continue to go up. This was a period of time in which the board had previously put in wage increases. The last wage increase that the county really received overall was over a year ago in November. And so what you'll start seeing in the future reports is that that wage is starting to flatten out. But for this point in time, it actually went up. Retired counts, they're going up. This year, 2010, we saw 105 retirees. So in future reports, you're going to see that number continue to grow, and then the benefit continues to grow. Again, one of the things that they found is that when people get closer to retirement, they promote. Their salary goes up. When you're doing a calculation for Percival Compensation, it's the highest annual salary, and so what you're going to see is the pension benefits are going up just from that. Key to the miscellaneous plan, and remember, this is our big one. This one has 5,000 folks in it, is that 46% of the active participants are age 50 or older. They are eligible for retirement by age right now. 52% of the retired participants are age 65 or older. But remember, the life expectancy is well into their 80s. So these folks are going to continue on our platform for a number of years, and we're going to have an influx of retirees into the platform as well. Safety plan's a little different. Public protection has been one area that the board is very focused on preserving and protecting, and as a result of that, you'll see that they do not see the decline in the active workforce that we saw in the miscellaneous plan, but you still continue to see an increase in the retiree base. This is a much younger group than the miscellaneous platform. Only 13% of the active participants are over the age of 50, and 28% are 65 or older in the retiree pool. So this group is going to be with us for a very long time. Hopefully we'll all be here. So in terms of the funding, we budget every year based on the actuarial reports we receive. The funding is listed out for you on what we spent over the last few years, and these are dollars spent for Board of Supervisors governed county employees, not for outside agencies like redevelopment, LAFCO, and air pollution. I have not included them, even though they are in our report. This is just from the county budget. These dollars include both sides of the equation, the employer cost and the employee cost. And as you can see in the picture, the costs are going up. So the pension actuarial report that we receive every year from CalPERS is point in time. It does not look forward for new hires. It literally just freezes your platform in place and says, what does it look like today based on the participation you have and the assumptions that we're doing. The liability that a county or a government agency incurs through the actuarial analysis is offset by the trust assets, and we get these reports every year. So let's first look at the miscellaneous plan. We have a liability total this year of $764 million. What's material to me is that that liability grew 14%, or $96 million, over the course of one study to the next in 1 year. Significant to that is the increase in the cost for the retirees and for the actives, and I attribute 100% of that to the change in the experience study. When they changed the assumptions that they're building the actuaries on, it also affects the liability. If you're going to live longer, it's going to be a higher liability. So the value of assets, this was the time when the market condition was awful. We lost 24% on the portfolio, and yet our assets did not go down. That's because we're continuing to contribute dollars to the trust, even though we're paying out pensions, and it still sees an increase. One of the biggest things that I'd like to have you take away from this presentation is the amount of the unfunded liability, which is at $187.7 million for the miscellaneous plan alone. Kathy Martinez, our county auditor controller, will report in her consolidated annual financial statements the actuarial funded status of the fund, which is at 75%. According to CalPERS, the actuarial funded status is used to set future rates because it includes the discount rate of 7.75% of investment earnings moving forward. So it looks really good. CalPERS, on the other hand, uses the market value of assets to really review plan portfolios. And the reason they do that is because it speaks to the solvency of the fund, of the portfolio, the ability to pay pension costs as they are being incurred, and that's what they look at. Our market value of assets for the miscellaneous plan is 55%. Similar in the picture for safety, smaller fund, smaller declines, but again, the unfunded liabilities at $67.8 million. The actuarial funded status is about 72%, but the market value of assets, or the solvency, is at 53%. The both plans combined, the unfunded liabilities, $255 million. We saw a growth in it of 41% year over year of $74.5 million. What I would say is that as I reviewed the reports and I looked at the difference between the actuarial funded status versus the market funded status, this is the first year in 5 years that the market value has not been higher than the actuarial value. So, and odds are it's even further back. I could go back and research that if you were interested. But market value usually is higher than the actuarial value. This is the first year that it's not. So how do we compare with everybody else in the state of California? You know, does it look bad? Well, it doesn't look great. But if you look at our particular funded status in our plans that we have today, we're a little bit lower than the miscellaneous 2.5% at 55, a little bit lower than the 3% at 50, and on all the average plans, funded status, a little bit lower. Again, all market value, because this is what CalPERS uses to compare the funds. In terms of the employer contribution rates, and this is pure employer, this is not employer plus a pickup for employee, pretty close, a little bit lower on the safety, a little bit higher on miscellaneous. But it sort of gives you a representation of what else is going on in the state, what other plans are going on, and the fact that other agencies introduced these same platforms at about the same time and are about in the same picture. That speaks to how difficult it was to recruit at that time, and in order to bring talent into the workforce, we had to be competitive with what was going on in other jurisdictions. And so everybody, it was sort of like this little, okay, well, we're giving you this, and it's like, well, we have to start giving you this because otherwise you won't come to us, you'll go over here. So recruiting was really an effort when they started putting in some of these new platforms. And I already talked to you about that. So I mentioned that I would talk to you about the investment return of 13.3% that we earned in 9/10. That doesn't show up on this report, but will affect the future actuarial report. What we know is that CalPERS gave us an estimate for the 12-13 budget cycle for the employer rates. Both of them are going up a little over 0.5%. The rates that they gave us were based on an 11% investment return, not 7.75, which is typical, but 11%, because I knew they were getting a better return in the year. It came in at 13.3. Based on what CalPERS is telling us, that should reduce those rates by about 0.5. So we should see pretty flat rates going into the next cycle, which will be 12-13. Not the budget we're preparing now, but 12-13. That was the good news. Having said that, the actuaries are very concerned about the discount rate that they're using in these reports of 7.75%, and have become much more conservative in their approach and the way they look at things since the economic downturn and the impact that it's had on these funds. Next month, in February, the actuaries will be going to the CalPERS board with a recommendation for the discount rate. Odds are it will go down. If it goes down from 7.75 to 7.5%, doesn't seem like much. It will increase our rates next year in miscellaneous by about 0.9% and in safety by about 1.19%. So it will have an effect on the county and the county budget. Based on what we're seeing from CalPERS estimating out, we see that pension costs are going to continue to go up. We expect a little bit of a flattening and then an increase, particularly in light of the wage increase or lack of. And again, a pictorial representation of that. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I do have Ann here. She is definitely our historian in terms of
questions by board members. Kirk.
As you're looking at the future pension costs, what are your assumptions by way of county's new hire activity?
I don't factor any new hires in. I essentially freeze the workforce. So the current base moving forward. However, I will point out, in 10-11, I have $38.9 million. We've budgeted about $41 million. I've already factored out any savings for vacant and funded positions, and so I move forward from that base.
As you know, we just heard a rather lengthy presentation in regard to the governor's proposed budget, and specifically the realignment portion of that, which is going to be directing an awful lot of activity back to the county level. And so I think it would be helpful for us looking at the new rate that we adopted for safety, and I'm referencing Captain Malam's presentation in particular, as we look at what it is that we might be required to do to staff up to receive approximately 350 new additional inmates that previously were state responsibility, what that might do to our obligation, particularly in those short years, because we will clearly be needing additional folks, and I think would be remiss not to budget accordingly.
Yes, sir. Agreed.
Kind of, if I might, on that end, we'll be doing future workshops on the county budget. One of the areas, public safety, fire services, based upon what we heard from the state budget, and options on the opening up the South Placer Jail. Embodied in that is whether or not you use correctional officers or deputy sheriffs, and then also looking at the new rates of all those new hires, too, as part of that workshop.
Anyone else? Jennifer.
Thank you, Therese. I think it's clear that we have some substantial issues facing us, barring whatever actions, as Supervisor Euler has referred to, that the state may take in relation to this. A couple of things that I just wanted to touch on briefly is I actually follow the CalPERS stuff a little bit, even though I'm not on it. I follow it not just because of my role here, but because my husband is a firefighter and is a member of CalPERS. One of the things that you mentioned that I think is really important to touch on is the fact that this really is a snapshot in time. This is June 2009, a lot of these figures we're looking at. And one of the things that you mentioned in here was on slide number 33. I want to make sure I understand this. It said with a 13.3% investment return for fiscal year 2009-10, the average funded ratio on June 30, 2010 should increase by 3 to 4% for both miscellaneous and safety plans. So does that mean what we're looking at, miscellaneous was funded at 75%, so that would increase by 3 to 4%?
I would expect that the actuarial funded status would go up, but the reference was from the market value, so they're expecting the market value to go up by the 3 or 4%.
Right, and my question was, do we have, again, I know we're looking at market value and the June 30th date, but do we have an idea of what the market value has increased by in that same time period between June 2009 and now? Understanding that, for example, just the overall market, and I realize that CalPERS may not invest in the same way that the overall market does, but the overall market this year has gone up by about 4%.
Essentially, the circular letter that came out was referencing the market values that were in this report that had come out, and essentially said, as of June 30th, 2010, we expect the market value to go up by the 3 or 4 basis points. So what you should see is somewhere closer to 58, 59% market value at the end of the report that we're going to get a year from now. We do not expect it to be going up substantively.
Mm-hmm. And then from June 2010 to now, obviously the market has continued to rise. So as of the snapshot of today, the market value, even though we don't know what that figure is specifically, is probably higher than the 55 to 58% that we're discussing here.
That's the beauty of these actuary reports, is that because they are point in time, future events will affect them, both good and bad.
Sure.
So hypothetically, if the market continues to improve, and we start seeing growth in the investment portfolios, absolutely these figures will adjust. Not a knee-jerk reaction. We will pay the rates that CalPERS sets, and the point for us is, in a budget process, we're going to see rate increases. That's going to affect our budget. The unfunded liability, hopefully, will correct itself, probably over 30 years, though, because of the amortization basis of 30 years. I prefer a 20-year amortization. It sort of brings it closer to a reality as opposed to spreading the stuff out. The other thing is that the investment portfolio loss that was done in 8 and 9 is going to be spread over 3 years. And so you've got this smoothing that's happening over at CalPERS to mitigate the impacts to agencies, but we're still seeing an impact to agencies through our budget costs.
Oh, no question. And then, again, just based on a conversation that I had with the CalPERS representative who came and spoke to my husband's group, one of the things that I recall him saying was that in terms of the actuarial number rather than the market number, is that 80% is considered to be a well-funded rate. And our actuarials that we're looking at are, frankly, and this is again as of June 2009, not too far off that, 75% and 72%. So while I have some real concerns about going forward and making sure that we do get this funded, I think barring whatever the state may do, I think it's important to realize that while we do have an issue, the sky is actually not falling here, and that we do have it within our control to address these issues and make sure that the long-term fiscal security of both the county and our employees are within our grasp to address. So, thank
Those
you.
are excellent comments. The one other thing that I might add to that is that as our workforce numbers, our active workforce, go down, this unfunded liability that we have that gets reevaluated every year will have a smaller group of people to spread that cost around over. And so essentially what you're going to see is that if our employee base doesn't go up by 400 or something employees for the jail, that the cost per employee may still go up. And so that's really the effect to the county, the more immediate effect to the county, than worrying about having to fund an obligation that hopefully will correct itself over time.
Anyone from the public? Seeing none. Ann, did you have anything to add, or just available for questions?
Ann Craig from Personnel Office. No, I think Teresa did a very good job summarizing it, and accurately so, that if you go back and you look at the market value of assets and you look at the accrued value and looking at those two, this is probably one of the first times we have seen those dramatic differences between that, and attributed obviously to the 2008 decline in the market. It's been an interesting process to watch CalPERS go through some of the changes that they've gone through, and speaking to their new actuarial, they're very fearful about changing the discount rate, because they realize that changing the discount rate and moving it even down 0.25%, as Teresa identified, has a tremendous impact on the overall plans and all their agencies. And they realize where the agencies are sitting within their own budget constraints, not, of course, addressing what might be coming down for many of these agencies. And so they're really wrestling with what's the best way to do that and how do they play that out and work with that. So we'll just have to wait to see what February brings, and probably March would be my guess. There'll probably be a couple of reviews on it as it comes forward.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay, we will now move to our 11 o'clock timed item, which is consideration for submittal the Placer County Conservation Plan, or what Lauren Clark has been doing in his spare time for the last 10 years. So, Michael, are you going to kick this off?
I will, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Michael Johnson with the Community Development Resource Agency. Staff is very pleased to be here today to present what is really the culmination of a process that started back in June 2005 with the receipt of a letter from the state and federal wildlife agencies on the county's initial submittal regarding the Placer County Conservation Plan. Since that time, we've had periodic presentations to your board, and today's presentation is looking for your authorization to again submit to the agencies an official document for their review relative to the county's proposal for the conservation plan. Lauren Clark with the agency will be making today's presentation.
Morning, members of the board, chairman, members of the public. There's a number of things we want to cover this morning in terms of background, and then move into sort of the elements of the plan itself, how we're approaching the conservation and mitigation, sort of the nuts and bolts of certain elements of the plan. In particular, we want to respond to agency issues that were raised when we submitted an earlier version of the Placer County Conservation Plan in 2005. And then lastly, we'll touch on the recommendations, which, as Michael Johnson mentioned, includes submittal of this rather formidable document to my right, the actual PCCP conservation strategy. As a reminder to the board, what we're seeking is regulatory coverage for a whole host of state and federal issues and regulations, statutes related to endangered species, regulated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, California Fish and Game, and others. But we're also dealing with waters, in particular wetlands, and how wetlands are affected in the United States. They're under the supervision of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in a very complicated and comprehensive regulatory program that they manage. Our basic objective is to fold those regulations into our own internal land development processes, procedures, regulations, and cover those regulations for the state and federal agencies. It's a shift from their oversight to our local oversight, where we will literally do the work on their behalf. In terms of why we're doing this, it's largely as a consequence of the changes that are anticipated in our environment, changes that are relatively predictable. We all spend a lot of time in land use and transportation and finance planning looking at how our economies change and how our land uses change. When we look into the future, we find around 150,000 new jobs coming to Placer County between now and the year 2060, also around 90,000 new households. That's between the unincorporated area west of Auburn and the growth in the city of Lincoln. There's other growth occurring in the county, but those areas are not being covered by the PCCP. We're looking at the city and the unincorporated county. That growth in jobs, that growth in housing will result in a change in the landscape. Between now and 2060, using a fairly aggressive assumption about growth and following traditional trends, not necessarily trends for a high intensification of land use, so a fairly conservative assumption, would result in about 57,000 acres of land being converted between now and 2060. A substantial portion of that is infill. Rural residential, which is a large part of our landscape, will continue to fragment. But we also see new urban places, primarily along the Highway 65 corridor, in areas west of the city of Roseville and west of the current city limits of Lincoln. That will result in a need for conservation. With or without the PCCP, those state and federal regulations will cause land to be acquired and protected and to some degree restored. Our prediction is on the low end 25,000 acres and on the high end around 46,000 acres of land. In terms of who's seeking coverage, it is the County of Placer, again, west of Auburn. It is the City of Lincoln for their current city limits, as well as their new sphere of influence area that matches their general plan boundary. Placer County Water Agency is seeking coverage for large major infrastructure projects as well as their maintenance activities. In the past, we were providing coverage for the South Placer Regional Transportation Authority, or SPARTA, for the Placer Parkway project. While we haven't closed the door on that participation, we believe that that will largely be covered by the county's request for coverage for that particular project. The primary point is Placer Parkway is covered. The agency that needs that coverage will receive that coverage. And again, in terms of what areas are being covered, this is a general representation, a simple representation of who's in, who's out. Areas that are in the cities of Roseville, Rockland, Town of Loomis, City of Auburn, and some small portion of their sphere of influence are not included within the coverage area. There are portions of both Auburn's and Roseville's sphere of influence that we are covering, the Sunset Industrial Area, North Auburn, and the Bowman area. All of the City of Lincoln's general plan footprint is covered as well. So back in 2005, we did receive a letter, and that letter was written in response to a plan that was submitted at that time. And since 2005, we have really been working towards responding to that letter and all the issues that were raised. So a lot of things have happened between then and today to this point where we have a plan before you. One is that the region has changed. We are not alone in these initiatives. There is a lot of conservation planning happening not only in the Sacramento region but throughout Northern California. Our neighbors all around us, Yolo, Sutter, Yuba, Sacramento County, even further to the north, Butte, and to the west, Solano County, are all involved in HCP and CCP efforts. There's a coordinated effort amongst those counties to be on point with the same messages. We all talk to each other. We share a dialogue with each other about legislative initiatives, about dialogues with agencies. So we're trying to ensure that we all get basically the same opportunity to get a plan put together with the same fair deal with the wildlife agencies. The other thing is probably the most important thing is we've prepared a map. That is what was lacking in 2005. The general criticism that is found in the agency correspondence largely derives from the fact that we were using standards as opposed to a reserve map as the primary issue that needed to be reconciled. In January of 2007, the board looked at the map to the left and said, let's start here. Here we are in January 2011. The map on the right is essentially the product of this conservation strategy and a lot of discussion. A lot of the discussion focused on where. Where are our priorities within the landscape that we want to see conservation occur? Land use is a primary consideration, transportation planning, but also factors such as parcel size, species richness, the integrity of the property, its ability to be managed in perpetuity as conservation land. Once you start to look at these factors, you get a good understanding of where in the landscape these important places are. When you combine all that together and you sort of sort out your differences both at the intergovernmental level but also with stakeholder participation and wildlife agency input, a map emerges. And there are some key elements of that map. One is an identification of the stream systems in Placer County as being important corridors for conservation. Two is that we want to build upon existing success, that there are existing conservation areas already set aside today that can serve as anchors for additional conservation. Three is we need to identify an area within which we would conduct our conservation activities. It's not all of that area, but a portion of that area would account for that 45,000 acres. We need to account for our development, that which is indicated in our general plans, a development area or potential future growth area. And then lastly, an identification that there are jurisdictions who are simply not participating, primarily the other cities in western Placer County. When you look at the breakdown, sort of the attributes of that map, You have about 16,000 acres of land already in conservation today, being managed as natural lands. So these are not our baseball fields, our parks. These are areas like the Hidden Falls Regional Park, the Bruin Ranch property that just went into conservation, and others. You have about an 80,000 acre area within which other conservation activities would occur between now and 2050. The potential future growth area, around 120,000 acres in size, accommodates all growth projections between now and 2060. So there's not a scarcity issue being raised in terms of insufficient land for growth. Based upon our general plan and the City of Lincoln's general plan, we can accommodate that growth within that footprint. We also spend a lot of time looking at vernal pools, and it clearly was an issue to the stakeholders to, at a minimum, have a reserve map that provided a minimum of one-to-one preservation, and this map does that. Geographically, we extend from the valley floor to about 1,500 to 1,600 feet in elevation. It's an area of the county that is predominantly the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas and Oak area, as well as grasslands and irrigation lands, irrigated pasture lands, and rice on the valley floor. There are two major river systems, both the Bear and the American, that anchor that to the north and to the south. The other key consideration is planning for natural resources goes beyond the political boundaries, goes beyond parcel boundaries, has to understand how systems function ecologically. Watersheds is a dominant theme in that understanding, so a lot of time has been spent both on work that's been done in the past in the county through Placer Legacy, as well as through the PCCP, to understand how watershed systems function. And as I previously mentioned, the 16,000 acres of existing conservation lands, this inventory is important to the PCCP. It's also very important to the county, in that the activities of Placer Legacy since 2000 and today, we will get credit for the good deeds that we have done, particularly when those lands are being managed for their natural resources. As I previously mentioned, the potential future growth area will account for approximately 57,000 acres of conversion between now and 2060 on a high-end estimate. On a low end, we've cut that number basically in half and said, what if we get half the growth? What is the amount of conservation? So we've looked at it from that range, a very aggressive growth rate that matched the trends of the past, say 3 to 4 years ago, as well as something that is much slower, at about half. The reserve acquisition area accounts for that growth. In particular, the vernal pool and the grassland landscape, where the majority of new urban growth would occur, had to be balanced to a minimum of the one-to-one, and this 70,000 acre area provides for that, as well as for that ongoing fragmentation of oak woodlands in rural residential settings. The stream systems is separate from the reserve acquisition area, but it is part of the reserve system. Right now, Placer County policies are, generally speaking, you avoid development in the floodplain. We also have structural setbacks within the zoning code where you can't build within a certain distance of streams. We're taking that concept into the landscape, but now folding it into a part of a management scheme in terms of overall how the reserve area is managed over time and actually in perpetuity. What's also important there is that the streams are providing habitat for endangered species, both in terms of salmon and steelhead, but also some other species that will be within the stream system or the riparian corridor itself. So we can't do all of our conservation work in that large landscape of the reserve acquisition area. We need to manage our streams as well. Also, we have had to develop an understanding of what happens inside that reserve acquisition area. There's more than just a large boundary, but an understanding of within that boundary that there are certain places, certain areas where we want to achieve certain goals. Yankee Slough is bisected by Highway 65 and the old 65, yet it's an important corridor for a linkage. That is a different understanding about the value of that resource than we need to protect the upper watershed of Yankee Slough, where we have one of the largest wetlands and grassland complexes in Placer County. So this map and the text that accompanies this map in the plan itself provide that level of detail, going beyond just a basic boundary of conservation. When you look at the individual community types, there's a number of things we're trying to achieve, but the most important point is we're conservation-based. By and large, what we're trying to do is preserve, not replace. So there's an acknowledgement that there is a loss of resources over time because we aren't necessarily always trying to replace them. The map itself generates ratios. So you look at ratios of preservation. Generally speaking, we're about 1-to-1 or 1.35-to-1. Certain rare communities, such as Valley Oak Woodlands and Riparian, have a higher ratio. So all of these ratios are the preservation ratios of the plan. You impact an acre, you set aside an acre of oak. You impact an acre of Valley Oak, you will set aside 3 acres of Valley Oak or pay a fee to accomplish that. Mitigation ratios are replacement ratios. You will actually cause an impact and you will put something back on the ground to replace that impact, particularly important for the Clean Water Act and no net loss. So primarily it's wetlands and stream-based. You have a ratio of 1.25-to-1 to replace that lost value. In terms of costs, obviously this is an expensive exercise to go through today for local government as we conduct our business, building both facilities and transportation networks. It's also very expensive for the private sector. So those costs exist today. As we transfer those costs into local government, we've had to predict into the future what that looks like. Land acquisition and restoration costs to the year 2060, so spread over those 50 years, is around $1.57 billion, again using that high-end estimate. The management requirement for that on an annual basis is around $8.4 million per year in perpetuity. All of those costs are borne by those who cause the impact. That's the key point. This is not a general fund dependent work program. The finance planning that is going into this plan will not rely upon the general fund. In terms of governance, we're forming a Placer Conservation Authority, which would be a joint powers authority comprised of the county and the city of Lincoln. They are not the regulatory body. The regulatory body is the individual local government, Placer County Water Agency, City of Lincoln. And in the balance of the discussion, I want to focus on the agency response, which is also included as a letter for the chairman's signature. First, in 2005, the agencies pointed out a willingness to work, and obviously we appreciate that, and they have demonstrated that over the past 5 years, that they've continued to provide excellent staff support to us. We've had some turnover, but there's been a consistency in terms of their message and their willingness to work. Secondly, is they were critical of the plan emphasizing mitigation as opposed to conservation, and we believe that this revised plan actually provides both a mitigation strategy and a conservation strategy. You're not just replacing land that was impacted, there's an emphasis on conservation of the balance of the entire landscape. There was also a concern raised at that time that the historic development pattern, historic trends of growth in the county would not integrate well with the PCCP. The big difference then is they didn't have a map to compare to. We believe now with a map that has a clear demarcation between where growth occurs and where conservation mitigation occurs satisfies that particular concern. They were also concerned about a lack of specificity, that it was not possible to measure within the landscape how we would meet our objectives. Again, in the absence of a map, you can't say we're going to protect 10,000 acres of vernal pools. With a map, you can now say that, and you can now measure that more specifically. They were also concerned about an earlier assumption about a high degree of avoidance that was built into the plan assumptions. We've actually rejected that in favor of now avoidance is de-emphasized. We agree with the agencies. There is actually built into the plan a whole series of criteria about the only occasions when you avoid is when it's large enough, around 200 acres, or you're connected to the stream system or connected to an existing reserved parcel. Similarly with vernal pools, they made a similar comment, don't avoid small areas of vernal pools, but also don't rely upon creation or restoration to a high degree. Again, we agree. The plan is based upon preservation of vernal pools and vernal pool grasslands. We only avoid when it's appropriate to do so, and we are not proposing creation, but only restoration of this particular landscape. Another criticism, which was fair at that time, was that there was an exemption for anything under 20 acres in size. We've accounted for that in the plan. There's a 1 acre exemption now in the plan where local ordinances such as the tree ordinance would still apply, or if you fill a wetland, small impacts would still apply. But generally speaking, we're accounting for impacts to oaks and grasslands under 20 acres. Criticism about terminology. The terminology is gone because it was relevant at that time. It is not relevant to the plan that has been prepared. Cost share assumptions. This is an area of significance to the county. We have an obligation to mitigate. We are looking to the state and federal government for assistance on conservation, for recovery of species. So while they've said it's too soon and premature to assume how much, and while we may agree that it's difficult to understand over 50 years, we still need to make the point that for the plan to be successful, there are state and federal obligations that have to be satisfied as well. This was a comment about the HCP 5-point policy. It's just a reminder that they've got their own rules about what needs to go into a plan. We simply will acknowledge that. The biological goals and objectives lack measurability. Again, a criticism because of a lack of a map. We now have a map, and from the map we derive ratios. The ratios in turn will derive the finance program. Monitoring and adaptive management. It was an incomplete chapter then. This is Chapter 7. It's essentially a complete chapter now, ready for agency review, and we believe that it's a suitable chapter for the plan that we've proposed. Similarly, Chapter 10 deals with change in unforeseen circumstances, the what-if scenario if the world changes from what we've predicted today. Again, a comment about financing that they raised. The plan today has Appendix J and K, which provides background information on cost model, as well as all the underlying assumptions about ongoing costs as well as one-time costs. All that information is being updated right now under a current contract that we have. A finance plan is not being prepared at this time, and we won't initiate that work program until such time that we have concurrence from the agencies that the conservation strategy is something that they can work with. We want a static work environment for that finance plan, and we hope to have that here shortly. In terms of where do we go from here, hopefully moving into more nuts and bolts. This plan will go out the door. We've asked for a 6-week turnaround. We understand from the agencies in our recent dialogue with them, they have committed staff to that review. In fact, they've started to look at the document. So in terms of the ad hoc committee role, should they continue to focus on the plan and have discussions about the plan, there are other things to talk about, such as the finance plan and the underlying assumptions, further discussion on a review of governance options. There's a memorandum of understanding that needs to come together with the Corps of Engineers. There's kind of a nuts and bolts document, the implementation agreement, that we will start working on that shortly. In terms of consultants and staff, coordinate the review with wildlife agencies on the plan itself, conduct public outreach, initiate the preparation of the REIS and finance plan once we're comfortable that the strategy is ready, and then continued coordination with the stakeholders. And then lastly, in terms of staff recommendations, one, we are recommending to the board that you authorize the submittal of the document to the wildlife agencies as an official response to the document that we sent in 2005 and their response back to us. Two, that you direct staff to continue to discuss the PCCP strategy with key stakeholders, in particular alternatives and information as we get it back from the agencies. Three, direct staff to initiate the preparation of the EIS finance plan and implementation agreement. And again, we will start that dialogue once the plan is ready for that serious consideration. And then lastly, to authorize the chair to sign a letter that is included in your package, which is a response to the June 2005 letter that was sent to Placer County. And with that, we're prepared to answer any questions that the board might have. Thank you.
Questions? Jack?
Yes, thank you, Michael and Lauren. I do appreciate your comments and the homework assignment this weekend. And based on the comments that I gave to you, it's probably a good idea not to give an attorney a document that says draft. So anyway, a couple of questions. I've had a couple of folks come up to me, and they were just concerned with regards to the plan and what it encompasses in some of the areas that are outlined for conservation. And the idea of taking, by designating a certain area for conservation, does that in any way, shape, or form constitute a taking? Is anything being taken away with regards to an entitlement or a right to that particular property?
The PCCP and built into the plan is a couple of important assumptions. One is that it is willing seller, willing buyer based. So any land that is acquired, as it is through the Placer Legacy program today, is only acquired from an individual who is a willing seller. Whether it's just simply on the marketplace, we find them, however, they are a willing seller, primary point being no condemnation. Secondly, the plan doesn't change any zoning district. The reserve mapping that has been prepared is not an overlay zone. It doesn't go into the zoning code. It simply identifies an area within which we seek to conduct conservation activities Those conservation activities are an allowed use under county code today. And third is those individuals who might be within a reserve acquisition area are still allowed to do whatever they're allowed to do under current zoning. So none of that changes. What might change over time is the amount of conservation that is occurring in the landscape, but that in and of itself obviously is not a takings.
Great. I also noticed that you used a study, or at least the consultants used a study from Colorado River and Contra Costa County with regards to the model in forecasting. Were those studies that were used, or those HCPs that were implemented, were those models found to be consistent with, and actual? Did they work for them?
East Contra Costa in particular has just started. We started at the same time in this work program 8 or 9 years ago, and they've got ahead of us. Now they're about year 2 into implementation. So it's too soon to actually say that the modeling expectations are now real on the ground with only a couple years under their belt. But I think what we do find, particularly with what's happened in Southern California, where these NCCP efforts have been in existence for over 10 years, is that as long as your financing is linked to your assumptions about the amount of growth, you should be sound. As long as you're able to manage your financing to account for increases in costs, then you should be financially sound. Where you find scarcity issues, and it happened in Natomas in particular, was an inability to have their fee stay up with the cost in the marketplace. Land got more expensive than the fees could provide for, and they got behind.
Great. And with regards to those assumptions, was there anything substantially different from those two studies as compared to the assumptions that were made to include in this PCCP?
No, but another important point is we're updating all of that at this time. So any of the work that was done around assumptions in 2005, 2006 with The Economist, at this moment, literally, they've begun the work at updating those assumptions. And that is information that should what was done then be updated today within a different context, we can daylight that to the Board of Supervisors.
And finally, with regards to, you mentioned the governance, and I don't want to get ahead of the ball here because we're just talking about this one piece. Real quickly, how do you anticipate that being put together? Are we looking bylaws? We're talking procedures, those kinds of things?
I'll turn to council in terms of actually formation of Joint Powers Authority and what those proceedings are. I don't know.
Yeah, the county has a great many JPAs, Joint Powers Authorities, and I would anticipate, assuming all the stakeholders agree, that would become, and it's been discussed, as the potential for the joint management of this organization. That would become a contractual arrangement that sets out the basic rules between the players, who's going to be represented, who's going to be governing, who's not going to be governing. Typically JPAs do not adopt bylaws. They can. They will necessarily adopt procedures and how they run themselves, how they conduct their business. And I think you are now going to be sitting on the Landfill Authority. You'll have an excellent example of a very long-established joint operation between multiple agencies that run a county-wide need. I guess that's probably 25, 30 years that that's been in existence. And then the Highway 65 GPA.
Thank you.
You get to fill in the details as you need them.
Anyone else on the board? Jennifer?
I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you for just an excellent presentation that covered a huge amount of territory in very few slides. But I also really want to say thank you to Chairman Wygant and to Supervisor Euler for all the work that you guys have done on getting us to even be able to consider moving ahead with these 4 recommendations today. You guys have put in an incredible amount of time and energy. I really appreciate how much that you really did put into this. And I want to thank the whole board, including former Supervisor Rockholm, for allowing the discussion of bringing the piece of District 5 back into it that we did end up bringing back into it. Because, Jack, in response to maybe your concern, I did get yelled at pretty substantially on this. But interestingly enough, it was by some people who wanted to be in the conservation area, not the future development area. And so that was that tells me that we were going the right direction, and people were very supportive of this. So thank you all.
Jim?
I just want to echo her thoughts. Michael and Lauren, thank you so much for all the hard work. And I know this has been going on for quite a while, and I know that Supervisor Wygant and Supervisor Euler always look forward to the PCCPA meetings after our lengthy board meetings. So I appreciate you sticking around after lunch and pursuing those efforts. Good job.
Kirk.
Lauren, you made the, I'm sorry? You made the comment about the state and federal obligation for mitigation. Would you expound upon that, please?
The state and federal obligation for conservation?
Sure, that's what you said. As you're flying through your slides, unnumbered, I will point out.
Mitigation and conservation. Mitigation is our responsibility, our collectively county, city, PCWA, for the impacts that we cause, just as it is today. But we're going beyond that in terms of trying to conserve the landscape in total and various elements of the landscape. So, for example, a grassland area, an agricultural area in Oak Woodland that may not necessarily be impacted might still be set aside because it helps build that overall reserve system. That watershed integrity issue, for example, is very important. Once you get beyond your mitigation requirement and get into those other areas of the landscape, then there are state and federal programs that help you get there. Those dollars are inaccessible to us today until such time that we have a plan adopted, and then we are pre-qualified to apply for those funds. Section 6 of the Federal Endangered Species Act being a very important one. So our primary issue is a reminder to the state and feds through this correspondence that while we can't predict how much they will provide between now and 2060, we still expect that they will provide.
Yet the finance plan that you briefly illustrated does not assume any participation of the federal and state agencies. Is that correct?
In the past, and I can't remember how we got to the number, we had around a 25 to 27% assumption. For purposes of today's presentations, I put to be determined.
Right. Okay. So just for those who will express the concern, and perhaps rightly so, about overall the program cost for acquisition and the ongoing monitoring and management, those are, we're relatively comfortable in $2,008 that those are fairly safe worst-case scenarios because we're not assuming any participation, yet we have reason to believe that we will receive participation from federal and state agencies.
Correct. By as much as, at least under earlier assumptions, 25%.
Okay. You pointed out that we have restrictions in the language in regard to parcel size, minimum parcel size for acceptance into the overall conservation strategy, and I believe that 200 acres was the number that you threw out. Yet there are exceptions to that, are there not?
Yeah, a parcel less than 200 acres of any size that is adjacent to the stream system, and providing that it can be managed. There's always that criteria. Can it be successfully managed in perpetuity? A parcel of any size that's adjacent to an existing reserve area. So you've already got a reserve area, and you're building on that. Adding 5, 10, 20, 50, 100 acres to that is simply making something bigger and better. We are a little bit concerned about isolated, standalone parcels less than 200 acres in size, and that's the chief reason for the 200.
And then I appreciate the comments from my colleagues in terms of the time that Robert and I put into this. And it occurs to me it was 4 years and 2 days ago that I signed up for this duty on January 23rd of 2007 when we started my second meeting back on the board. And boy, I thought I would have been smart enough for my first tour duty that I wouldn't have gotten myself into this. But I want to recognize not just I appreciate, Robert and I, your acknowledgement of us. Staff has done a tremendous job managing personalities, shall we say, as we've gone through this. And though it's nice to reach a point where we do speak with a fairly unified voice, certainly wasn't always the case in some of our conversations in the conference room or in the CEO's office. But I'd also be remiss if I didn't recognize the ongoing participation of some of the key stakeholders. Bob Shattuck with Lennar, Julie Hansen with AKT, Sierra Club representative, I saw him here earlier, Where's he hiding? Oh, there he is. Terry Davis is here, and Ed Pandolfino in particular, where we have reached items where we might have stumbled in our conversations with the agencies. It was very impressive and encouraging to see how representatives of the environmental community and the business community came together to encourage agency participation and cooperation on some key issues that might have been stumbling blocks and potentially could still be. We'll see, but we're hoping not. And so I know that the four of them, as long as a number of others, have put in a lot of hours on this as well. So I just very much appreciate your participation in this process.
I'm going to open it up to the public, but just briefly, to one of your points, Jack, since Supervisor Holm likes to point out how old I've gotten since I've been on the board, back in 1997, when we actually started our open space program, now known as Legacy, the board, even way back then, had a very key concern about the takings issue or interfacing inappropriately with market mechanisms. So the board took a strong stance in not even allowing our legal right to use condemnation in this whole process, not to mention extracting anybody from their economic value to their property. And I like to argue that if you're in the conservation reserve area, unless you assume that you can get a dramatic rezoning on your property, which is a privilege, not a right, I think you actually have a significantly increased layer of prospective value to your property, because now, with market mechanisms working, if you happen to have marketable habitat value on there, you can continue to farm or live in a rural residential setting or whatever it is that you're doing. But additionally, you would have an option perhaps of selling a conservation easement and some incredible revenue that could come from that. And that takes me, Lauren, just one concern I want to make sure that we continue to address. We've discussed it a lot over the years. But as we undertake the financial study and our modeling, we do want to make sure that it emphasizes that, you know, we have a surplus of urban plan zoning property based on our expectation and a very aggressive growth rate prospectively over the next 50 years. That's important for the markets to work. Similarly, we don't want to be in the business of just collecting fees and hoping that the market changes and habitat values will be resolved. I know that we have the stay-ahead requirement in the plan, but we want to make sure that we embrace to the fullest extent possible all of that so that the system will function normally and methodically, and we won't end up with any constraints. So with that, I'll open it up to the public.
Terry Davis with the Sierra Club. Gee, Kirk, that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Anyway, it was over 8 years ago that Fred Yeager contacted me and asked me if I wanted to be on the biological working group, and I didn't really realize what a marathon I was in for. But obviously, I think over all those 8 years, I probably have missed 1 or 2 meetings only. So it kind of shows the level of belief in regional conservation commitment to this plan that I have felt moving forward. And I think the first agency review draft really went out without real substantive input from the stakeholders. And that, in fact, frankly, I don't think we were capable at that time of substantive input because we didn't really understand the plan. But obviously the agencies pretty much chewed it up and spitted it out. And now this agency review draft, I think, has gotten, I think, really good substantive input from the stakeholders. I think staff and consultants, it's a much more thoughtful product. And I'm really optimistic about how it's going to be received by the agencies. For the environmental community, I think we see in the PCCP as really offering us security, a real knowledge, a real security about what the ultimate build-out of the county will be, what the footprint for growth will be over the long term, and what the the footprint of conservation will be over the long term, and the fact that we are going to have representative habitats in western placer preserved and protected over time. So we have that biological function and species survive. And that means a lot to us, a great deal, means everything to us, really. And I see on our part the kind of years of conflict and litigation in western Placer County come to a close when this plan is adopted. And I look forward to that. And, we wouldn't have gotten to this point, which I think is a very important point, and hopefully we're getting down the home stretch, seventh inning stretch at least. But, without a consistent champion on the Board of Supervisors and Supervisor Wygant, there's this kind of roller coaster ride of different makeup of the board, iterations of the map, certain conflicts between partners. It was important to have that consistent champion on the board for this plan. I really appreciate that. And on the staff level, Lauren Clark. He's had the steady hand, known for his transparency and even-handedness, fairness, and often it seemed like he was the only guy in the room who really understood the whole darn thing. So, let's bring this plan home. And again, I want to thank everybody who made this possible, and that includes Kirk. So thanks to all.
Thanks, Terry.
I'd like to echo everything that was just said. In particular, Friends of Placer County Communities that I had the dubious privilege of being a part of for a period of time is no longer there, doesn't have a need for it. A lot of things have happened in this period of time, and one of my very dearest friends, Al Clark, was our vice president for a period of time, and I learned a lot from him, and I got to know Lauren very well through it all. And I would agree, it's been your steady hand, sir, that has really made this whole thing happen. He had an opportunity to have the top job in the planning department, but he didn't take that. He took another opportunity, and I think he did the right thing by doing that. And it's a marvelous and wonderful program that's being put together, and I congratulate you all. It was exciting to hear this today, and I'm so glad it's coming through. Thank you. Dale Smith.
Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I'm Bob Shattuck. I'm with Lennar. I'm also a property owner in Placer Vineyards and a landowner representative on the Biological Working Group. And I may need a drink of water before I say this, but mostly I want to agree with Terry Davis today. I do need a drink of water. I do want to, honestly and seriously, I want to support the staff recommendation today. I'm very encouraged by the work done to date. We hope and intend to take advantage of the PCCP in Placer Vineyards and on other properties that Lennar owns and controls. In particular, I want to take the opportunity to commend the county for its perseverance. I heard 1997 mentioned, and that's quite a long road. I was thinking my son, who's a graduate student at UC Davis, was 10 years old in 1997, so that's quite a stretch. Want to commend the work of the ad hoc committee who broke the ice on all of the important issues and allowed this thing to move forward when it looked like it probably could not. And I want to commend the work, collaborative nature of the Biological Working Group. I think the group itself, which I've been kind of a late addition to, has done a good job. It's fair to say there's a wide variety of perspectives on that group. It's fair to say that those perspectives are not always in perfect alignment, and yet everybody respects each other's viewpoint. We've gotten to where we're pretty good at anticipating each other's priorities and finding constructive solutions. And I really think that your staff really does set the tone for that. They've done a really good job in that regard. This is an important milestone. I do hope that federal and state agencies respond positively, as Terry indicated he's optimistic they will. I hope his optimism is well-founded. I do think that there are a couple of issues that will really, the feasibility of this whole effort will still hinge on. One of them is the degree to which the 404 wetlands permitting process can be folded in. I think that's still an open question to some degree, and the degree to which it's folded in will have a real influence on whether anybody utilizes this plan and how effective it is. The second thing that is often easy to overlook is the degree to which O&M costs are rolled into and have to be funded by endowments. The reason I put that forward, it's really, really important to minimize the amount of O&M that gets rolled into categories that have to be funded by an endowment, because at a 2% cap rate, for every dollar increase or creep that you get over time in the costs of those that have to be funded by endowment, you get a $50 increase in the fee. You get astronomical fee escalation over time based on that, and it's a real challenge to the feasibility of any of these plans. And so I appreciate your time. Again, just want to encourage the support for the staff recommendation, and thanks for the opportunity to comment.
Thanks, Bob. Anyone else? Please.
Hello, my name is Jim Martin. My wife Nanette is in the audience. Our families have farmed in Placer County for approximately 60 years. We're pretty familiar with rice farming and the economics that govern it. I have spoken, I've had the pleasure of speaking with many of you associated with the county over a number of years. I was, or I hope I still am, on the biological work group and the agricultural work group. I was also employed by the Department of Fish and Game, Water Resources Control Board, Division of Water Rights here in California for many decades. I'm quite familiar with habitat restoration and or creation, and let me assure all of you that it can be done very, very, very well, particularly as the years go forward. It gets done better, more cost-effectively, higher ratios of success, on and on. From an agricultural point of view, I really hope, and I haven't seen the most recent plan, we haven't been receiving notices as we used to, but I would like to read it, and I would really, in all fairness and respect, encourage you to incorporate, maybe it's in there, safe harbor for farming activities. Farming is tough. We've been paying taxes in the county for 60 years, say, plus or minus a little. We have hired and sustained and supported many, many families in our farming activities, and it's all been very good. But in doing this type of thing, if you have conserved or PCCP lands next to farmland, if there is, for instance, public use there, school kids, various programs, this type of thing, and you've got farmers that are trying to use herbicides and pesticides to stay in business, excuse me, all of that needs to be considered, because if you can't spray or use herbicides because of competitive uses that weren't clear earlier on. I know I heard Mr. Davis say that he was representing conservation, and I took that to mean conservation agencies or those entities, but for myself and my wife representing some farming interests, you have to be able to do those types of things. You have to be able to go ahead and get that herbicide, fertilizer, pesticide on the ground when you can go ahead and harvest 80, 90, or 100 sacks an acre. And we're approaching that 100 sacks an acre limit now. Cal rice is a very, very important commodity all over the world, particularly in Asia. So I think that sums it up. Do any of you have any questions for me?
I don't see any.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the board. Tony tells me that we can take all items together in one motion, but first I just want to thank all of the stakeholders that have been involved in the process. I'd like to state that I think we have a plan that's historic. I think we're one of 2 plans, Lauren, that have been submitted in the country that used the Clean Water Act to try to glue this whole package together, if I understand all those technical parts properly.
We might be the only plan.
Might be the only one. So when this plan is finally adopted, huge prizes for all stakeholders at the end of that tunnel, but we've got a couple of years probably to get through that. So just simply request that everybody still continue to participate and give the kind of effort. And thank you, Kirk, for the time that you spent on the committee and what we might do in the future. And Michael, for all the resources that you provided, County Exec's office for sure, we've spent a small fortune getting to this particular point, but I think we have some incredible value at the end of that tunnel if we can finish up our work. And Lauren, I have to personally thank you for going way above and beyond any staff effort at a very professional level. Just a minute. There are times when things were very bleak and you hung in there and did everything necessary and did it in a way that I heard a lot of stories and comments during this process, but never a negative, harsh criticism about you professionally. So thanks for all of that effort. And now you can say whatever you want.
I simply wanted to pass that credit through. You know, we need to acknowledge some folks if we can as well, some of which are probably listening in right now. But we've had excellent support with our consultants, TRA Environmental, Thomas Reed, Aaron Gabby in particular, Houserath Economics Group, longtime partner with the county on things related to fiscal and financial, Sally Nielsen, Resources Law Group, Chris Beal has absolutely been a fundamental and important partner in this, and also staff at CEDRA, Edmund Sullivan, Chris Brown on the GIS, who's just been magic, and of course Jennifer Bios, who's provided all the staff background to this date. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark. What's the pleasure of the board?
Mr. Chairman, after 4 years and 2 days.
But who's counting?
Me. It would be my pleasure to make the motion to recommend the approval of staff's recommendation, and we move this conservation plan on to the next step.
Second.
Moved in second to adopt staff recommendation. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thanks. Now, after 12 o'clock, Jim, I don't want to put any pressure on you, but we're going to go to Department Item 5, which is a resolution approving findings and authorizing county exec to spend $18 million redevelopment. So let it quiet down a little bit.
As Mr. LeBou's coming up to the podium, if I can't take a couple of minutes to introduce this item, Mr. Chairman, I'd appreciate that. There's been quite a bit of controversy lately in terms of redevelopment agencies looking to encumber their proceeds, especially in light of the governor's proposed budget that we spent some time exhaustively this morning talking about how redevelopment agencies factor into the overall state budget process. I want to assure your board that this is a recommended series of actions by Mr. LeBou that are prudent in nature, that really aren't looking to encompass all the proceeds of redevelopment agency in terms of those under your authority over the next 20-year period. It really addresses those particular projects that your board is, I think, very familiar with, that are really in the near term. Probably the key one here is the Kings Beach Core Improvement Project, which is money that your board has factored into funding that in order to bring that to success. So this does not encumber all redevelopment dollars. It could be over the life of the redevelopment plans, which some jurisdictions have seen fit to do. It really talks, and it doesn't encumber administrative dollars either. This really talks about items that have been identified in the budget as near term, whether they're Highway 49 or they're Kings Beach or other types of things. So we feel that what we brought forward to you as an overall recommendation is a middle ground to accomplish those things that are already partially funded by other funds, so we don't leave gaping holes in those projects, or things that are very much in the near term, while leaving potentially redevelopment dollars on the table that can be factored into the conversation with the governor's office on how to best work forward through this realignment process. And with that, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to turn this over to Mr. LeBou.
Jim.
Thank you. The action before you, the item before you is to approve a cooperative agreement for the county, to approve a cooperative agreement with the redevelopment agency whereby the redevelopment agency would obligate $18,403,619 for a series of projects and programs. This is a companion item to item 6C on the redevelopment agency agenda, also today. Just echoing what Tom just explained, this is an action related to the discussion we had earlier this morning, which would create a contract between the county and the agency in the event that the governor's proposal is successful and the redevelopment agency is eliminated come July 1st. Those funds would then become available to the county to implement these projects and programs. And I do want to emphasize, like Tom did, that none of these are new projects or programs. They're all the projects and programs that you've been seeing in our budget, you've approved in our budget. We've been working on them for years. They're listed in the exhibits to the agreement. And they are 15 million of the 18.5 million are existing funds that we already have. The one exception is an obligation for $3.5 million to fund transportation improvements in the Sunset area that your board has previously approved committing those funds in order to contribute to that overall benefit district, which as a result, development impact fees in that area, which are already some of the highest in the entire county, are not as high as they would be if all of that burden had to fall on new development. So if you have specific questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Kirk?
No, I'm sorry.
Tom, did you?
No, I'm sorry.
I don't see any. Is there anyone from the public who'd like to address us? Did you have more, Jim? I just personally want to thank you for I know that as soon as the governor's budget hit the street, Jim, you spent a tremendous amount of time looking at our prospective exposure, so I appreciate you doing all of that work and bringing it back to us at the earliest possible time. So pleasure of the board.
Move approval. Second.
Moved and seconded to approve staff recommendation. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
And next, Jim, you have Quartz Ridge Family Apartments.
Kathy and Donovan is going to make this report.
Pardon? Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. New chairs. We are going to adjourn as the Board of Supervisors and reconvene as the Placer County Redevelopment Agency.
I'm sorry.
Some learn slowly.
Yeah. Is that SC or?
Good afternoon, Kathy Donovan, Redevelopment. The agency is requesting authorization to execute an amendment to the pre-development loan for Quartz Ridge Family Apartments for a total not to exceed loan amount of $350,000.
I'm sorry.
The $250,000 amendment is for architectural and engineering designs to bring the project ready for improvement plan review with the county. Do you have any questions?
Are there any questions, Board member? I see none.
Yeah, actually, I have
Jack.
a question. With regards to the Quartz Ridge Family Housing Project, I noticed that it says that they are going to be applying for additional funding, and that if the funding doesn't come through, there's still an opportunity to forgive, the additional monies. Is that a standard industry practice for that?
Yes, it is. A pre-development loan to a developer that doesn't own the property. They are using their own resources for all of the work outside of the third-party services, and that is what we would be paying for. It is our intention, though, to enter into a disposition develop agreement when financing becomes available, and at that time, that money would remain a loan.
Okay, so in the event that financing wouldn't occur, the county would still get a benefit by having all of the entitlements to that property?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Jennifer?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to make clear, because a couple of people actually asked me about this out in the community, that the $350,000 that we are talking about today is part of the $2 million that was already included in the fiscal year 10-11 budget. So these are not additional dollars. These are not new dollars. This is just part of that $2 million that was already envisioned for this project.
That is correct.
Thank you.
See no other questions. Is there anyone from the public who'd like to address this item?
I'm Dale Smith, and speaking on the behalf of my company, Alpha Mega Associates. One thing I did learn a lot today about sitting through all of this is very interesting. Honorable Supervisor, it's a pleasure to be here once again, especially to see a new supervisor. Mr. Durand, good to have you on board. You got a lot ahead of you. Last Friday, I spent the day in the planning department scanning documents for the California Public Records Act, CPRA, on the Silver Bend apartments. Whatever the name may be this week, seems like it changes just about every week or so. It was an educational experience, but it was a disappointing experience for me because only about 30% of the documents that we were looking for were there. And I want to thank Scott Finley for his help in getting this all to happen. There was some interesting documents we did find there, and in particular one that has to do with this particular issue that we have before us here today. And here's the first page of a letter, which I want to turn in, a copy for you, for each one of you. And this is a letter that was sent out by my company, and was sent out on the 18th of May last year. And you see, and you look up in the right-hand corner, you'll see some writing in blue up there. And for the public, that quote says, advised by Karen Schwab to not review/respond unless accompanied by an appeal. Was signed by L. Lindbow, and that closes the quotes. Now, none of the documents that were in that file, and for sure, they did not go to the Carzon Company, which is doing the soil contamination investigation. However, by this time, Carzon does have them because I overnighted them to them last night. Now, I've asked attorneys that I work with whether or not that act was legal or illegal, and I had a variety of opinions. I leave that up to the legal people. It cannot be very ethical in any way you look at it, even if it's not illegal. And by the way, if you've ever wondered what happened to Leslie Lindbow, who left our area very quickly, she's the Director of Environmental Health in Yolo County. I'm refiling all this set of documents again today, along with several others, and I expect to see them in the Placer County files, having been distributed to all that ought to see them this time around, please. And finally, I want to thank you, esteemed members of this board, for your continuing support of my legacy as a fighter for the rights of the citizens in Placer County. It may sound strange, but it comes right straight from my heart. I think that these kinds of questionable actions by staff doesn't do much to help your cause and does mine. Now, I just want to wind it up with one more thing. If you approve this over $250,000 more funds for that rat hole, you ought to think twice about another job, because it really is a huge amount of money that's been poured into that, and I don't see how that money can ever be realized. Here's my documents to turn in. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Anyone else from the public? Seeing none, I'll close public comment and bring it back to the board for questions, comments, action.
You have approval?
Is there a second? Yeah. Sorry, Jay. It is moved and seconded to approve staff recommendation. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next item, Jim, is Lake Forest Water Improvement District project.
Michelle Kingsbury will be giving this report.
Good afternoon, Michelle Kingsbury with the Redevelopment Agency. This is a funding agreement for approval before you with the Tahoe City Public Utility District to provide $400,000 toward the Lake Forest Water Improvement Project. They recently received their order of possession, which grants them full authority to proceed forward with the water upgrade system. The system as it is today is deteriorated and has outlasted its useful life. The project costs are about $2.3 million, so it's a small increment toward the project cost, but it'll allow them, they're proceeding forward and applying for Prop 50 funds, USDA funds, to augment the rest of the project costs. With that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Questions? Jennifer?
Michelle, thank you. I just want to, this is sort of a question, but just want to make sure that this is something that's been on our radar for a long time. There were discussions with the former supervisor about this possibility. One of the very first things that I discussed with Rich Colwell when I came on board, and the nexus really here with redevelopment is that the area, Lake Forest, that this water system serves, and I use serve very loosely, people are unable to do any kind of development or redevelopment in the area because the infrastructure is so old, so unreliable, and there have been issues with water contamination. People have to boil their drinking water or bring it in from out of the area. People literally can't even pull permits to remodel their homes. So not to mention the issues with fire flow and fire protection in the area as well. So this really does have a nexus with the redevelopment agency and redevelopment dollars. Taking this, taking this project forward through the Tahoe City Public Utility District will allow that area to tear down old stuff, build new stuff, develop previously undeveloped properties that are there, and I just really would encourage us to move forward with this, to allocate these funds, because frankly, this is something that's been on our radar for a very long time. We've kind of been waiting to see what happened with the lawsuit for adverse possession, and that did occur. That was awarded to the Tahoe City PUD, I believe, in early January, so or late December. So I would just encourage this board to go forward.
Any other questions, Colin?
Well, I'm going to see if there's any public comment.
Is there any public comment? I see none.
Move approval.
Second. Moved and seconded to approve the State Lake Forest Water Improvement Project District recommendation by staff. It includes a budget revision, so we need a roll call.
Montgomery?
Yes.
Duran?
Yes.
Holmes?
Yes.
Euler? Wygant?
Yes. And last but not least, Jim, cooperative agreement. This is the other side of our recently taken board action regarding encumbering our redevelopment agency funds. So
Correct, and you've already heard the report. It's just a mirror image, the redevelopment agency making the same approval of the agreement that the county board already did.
moved and seconded to approve the cooperative agreement as the redevelopment agency. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you very much.
We will now adjourn as the redevelopment agency and reconvene as the Board of Supervisors and go into closed session, I'm assuming, Tony.
Yes, the board will take up the matters on page 3 of its agenda, item 7. There's 2 existing litigation matters. I think Mr. Miller wants to give an update on the real property negotiations, and that closes this report. We'll come back with a report later. Right, Ann?
Thank you.